Hello everyone, and welcome back to Kevin Audiobook TV. I'm Ben Harrison, and before we jump into today's story, I'd like to share a little personal update with all of you. My wife is expecting our very first baby, and the due date is right around the time of the World Cup final. As you can imagine, life has been pretty exciting and a little nerve-wracking lately. We've been getting everything ready, and honestly, I don't think either of us has ever been this excited or this nervous before. Since this is our first child, I know there are probably a lot of parents listening right now. If you've been through this journey before, I'd really appreciate any advice you can share. Is there anything you wish someone had told you before your first baby arrived? Any tips for a soon-to-be dad? Feel free to leave your advice or your own stories in the comments. I genuinely love to read them, and I'm sure other first-time parents in our community would enjoy them too. Thank you all for your patience and for the incredible support you've shown me and this channel. It truly means a lot, and I can't wait to introduce our little one to this amazing community someday. Now, for today's special episode, I've put together a compilation of Shadow Slave chapters 3065 through 3099. These chapters wrap up the final stretch of the 3000s before we move on to the exciting milestone of chapter 3100. Whether you're catching up on the story or simply enjoying another adventure through this incredible world, I hope you have a wonderful time listening. So grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let's return to Shadow Slave. Chapter 3065. Worst place for a shadow to be. Saint landed lightly and gracefully, like a leaf carried by the wind. Neff's landing, however, had been quite violent, sending a net of fractures radiating outward through the weathered dark stones beneath them. Once the dust settled, the world was enveloped by silence. The boundless darkness surrounded them from all sides, and even if Sunny could sense its currents and peer into its depths through Saint's, he still could not determine how vast the space around them was. There was a stone surface under their feet, rough and uneven. Some distance away, jagged rocks protruded from it, basking in the endless darkness. Beyond the rocks, something resembling a ruin loomed at the edge of Saint's perception, barely visible in the dark. The sphere of light emanated by Nephis was still under assault, the crushing weight of elemental darkness bearing down on it with unrelenting force, but it did not shrink anymore. In fact, when Nephis focused and defied the pressure exerted upon her by the underworld, the darkness retreated a bit, chased 100 more meters away. A radiant light illuminated the dark expanse of the underworld for the first time in thousands of years, or simply for the first time, possibly revealing a desolate vista. The three of them observed their surroundings, wary and on edge. A minute passed in tense silence, then a few minutes more. Finally, Sunny exhaled slowly. "I don't think that the Dark One is going to attack immediately." The creature of darkness seemed to have retreated, even if Sunny still felt like he was being observed. That feeling had grown weaker and was now barely perceptible, but it was still unnerving. Nephis nodded slowly. "Seems so." She lingered for a few seconds, and then added, "If it is going to attack at all." Sunny was surprised to hear that. "When has there ever been an instance when a detestable horror failed to try and attack us?" But then he caught himself. Oh, right. Sunny was used to dealing with nightmare creatures who were all vessels of corruption. As such, they were in a state of inherent conflict with the world around them, suffering a constant agony and driven mad by the desire to destroy and consume the flame. That was why abominations were unfailingly aggressive and uncontrollably hostile toward humans. However, what they were dealing with here was a creature of darkness. True darkness might have been born from the blood of a void being, but it was not a force of corruption in and of itself. Instead, it was uniquely unaligned, belonging neither to the void nor to the flame. Therefore, preconceived notions built upon his experience with nightmare creatures could not be applied to it. How peculiar! Although the creature of darkness had attacked them, it was not inherently a hostile force. The reality of facing an abomination that was not hell-bent on killing him for no reason whatsoever was a new and deeply strange experience. It was an unfamiliar feeling. Sunny scoffed quietly. So why did it attack us in the first place? He wasn't accustomed to asking such questions, so even speaking those words aloud felt weird. Nephis lingered for a moment, then shrugged. The creatures of darkness you encountered before were feeding on shadows. So it might have attacked us, because she sensed a supreme shadow among us, a tasty snack, so to say. A mischievous smile found its way onto Sunny's face. "Oh, so you think that I'm tasty, huh?" Nephis glanced at him silently for a few seconds, then continued in the same even tone. "Alternatively, it might have been hostile because of me. The underworld is a land of darkness. The being hiding in it might have been provoked by the invasion of light into this dark realm." Finally, she shook her head. "There's no way to tell until we learn more about that thing, and about this place as well." She had been to the underworld before, but only to its lowest desolate reaches. The underworld, she knew, was from thousands of years ago too. Who knew how it had changed in the wake of the world-ending war between its ruler and the gods? Nephis did know a few things about it, though. Looking around, she spoke quietly. "We are currently at the base of the Hollow Mountain, on the boundary between the upper and middle strata of the underworld. This cavern is technically already a part of the core expanse of Nether's realm. However, the underworld is not one gigantic subterranean space. It is composed of countless interconnected caverns, some relatively small, some as large as underground continents." Sunny nodded. The Hollow Mountains were vast. A long time ago, it had taken him more than a year to cross them. And he had been moving from south to north as well, while the titanic mountain chain mainly stretched from east to west. So, a realm hidden beneath them had to be immense. Nephis hesitated for a moment, and then added, "Since this mountain had an established path to the surface world, there should have been a small settlement of the Stone Saints somewhere in this cavern. We can start our search there." Sunny's expression was glum. "But there's a problem, isn't there?" He shook his head. "The entrance we chose is situated in the outer reaches of the Hollow Mountains, and is relatively easy to access, so it was a good candidate for the one your father and his cohort had chosen to enter the underworld. However, as saints, they would not have survived the battle against that creature of darkness. In fact, after spending just a few minutes in the underworld, I'm not sure how they had survived that journey at all." Nephis smiled faintly. "As saints, they would not have been as arrogant as we are. They probably used a different entrance and relied on caution and stealth to travel toward the seed. My father was a resourceful man, and his companions were all exceptional in their own right as well. The King of Swords, the Queen of Worms, and the Dream Spawn. Now that we have defeated them, the shadows they cast do not seem so frightening, but in their own time, they were the strongest champions of humanity." Sunny scratched the back of his head. "Yeah, and they weren't fated either. Who knew? Possibly it was just his luck to stumble into an ancient horror of true darkness immediately after entering the underworld." He sighed. "The problem still stands. If the underworld is so huge, then how are we going to find what we are looking for?" It was a rhetorical question. In truth, Sunny already knew that their course of action had to be. The underworld might have been impossibly vast, but the Stone Saints had never been a populous people. Their settlements were small and far between except for the main city hidden in the heart of the underworld, where Nether himself had dwelled. And since seeds of nightmare mostly bloomed where sentient creatures congregated, the best chance of discovering traces of Broken Sword was to slowly make their way to the seat of Nether's power. They were not going to have to travel on foot either. People, those of them who knew what the underworld was, mostly imagined it as a dark, cavernous expanse of desolate stone, a lifeless desert hidden in the depths of the earth. But while some of that was true, there were actually great subterranean rivers flowing through the underworld, connecting its distant parts to each other. There was even a vast underground ocean, complete with its own menagerie of frightening depth dwellers, according to the stories Nephis had heard in her second nightmare at least. The civilization of the underworld might have been unique, but the Stone Saints weren't that different from humans in many regards. They too had used waterways to transport cargo and connect their settlements, so most of the local settlements were situated along the shores of one of the three largest rivers, and since there was supposed to be a settlement in the cavern Sunny, Nephis, and Saint had entered, there was a high chance that an outlet of one of those rivers flowed through it, as well. Sunny hesitated for a moment and then sighed. "Well, what are we waiting for then? Let's go find that settlement." After catching their breath for a few seconds, the three of them cautiously headed toward the ruins vaguely seen in the distance. Saint served as the vanguard of their small party, walking in the darkness ahead. Sunny and Nephis followed, ready to react to any danger. As they traversed the vast expanse of darkness, Sunny looked around, a peculiar expression slowly appearing on his face. Noticing it, Nephis raised an eyebrow. What? He hesitated for a bit, then shook his head. No, it's nothing. I was just thinking that it's a bit ironic. Actually, no, it might very well be the pinnacle of irony. He smiled wistfully. I never thought about it before, but look around. Shadows have to pass through the underworld to reach the shadow realm, but the underworld is drowning in true darkness. So shadows have to complete a journey through a realm that is inherently hostile to them in order to find peace. There's literally no worse place for a shadow to be. Sunny fell silent for a moment, then chuckled. Although, perhaps it's not ironic after all? Maybe it's poignant and full of meaning instead. Nephis studied him silently. Doesn't the shadow realm destroy the shadows, grinding them into pure soul essence? I'd say that is worse. So, the worst place for a shadow to be is the shadow realm. Sunny stared at her with a funny expression. After a while, he turned away. Now that's definitely poignant and full of meaning. Chapter 3066. Dark splendor. Sunny could not get used to how small and bleak his world had become without shadow sense, feeling exposed and uncomfortable. As they drew near the ruins, he could not tell if something was hiding behind the old stone, or if danger was lying in wait. All he could tell was that the air seemed colder here, and that it smelled of water. The quiet sounds in the distance told him that the river they had been searching for was close. To reach it, however, they would have to traverse the ruins and face any potential peril that hid there. Sunny glanced at Nephis briefly, then grimaced, and continued walking forward. The two of them caught up with Saint, who entered the ruins first. The settlement where the stone saints had dwelled sprawled around them, desolate and empty. They had been created by Nether, a great artisan among the daemons, so their dwellings were built with stellar craftsmanship as well. Constructed from dark stone, the settlement had endured the end of the world and eons of desolation well. The buildings were tall and magnificent, imposing in their solemn beauty. Their facades were adorned with intricate decorations, sweeping colonnades and beautiful rotundas, standing upon pools of black water. It must have been a place of dark splendor once, but now it was all hollow and pointless, devoid of movement and life. The streets were drowning in dust. The walls of the building were covered by fractures and deep cracks. The reliefs and decorations had been eroded by the passage of time, and some of the dwellings had crumbled. The recent rain of shattered stone had caused more devastation, damaging many buildings and causing some of them to collapse. Saint seemed to know her way around, navigating the wide streets with measured, confident steps. Sunny gave her a curious look. He had rarely considered her life before the two of them met on the forgotten shore. Back then, Saint and her kin had already succumbed to corruption, guarding a square in the dark city against other nightmare creatures. In the end, an especially fierce clash ended their profane existence and allowed Sunny to slay the original Saint and make her a shadow. But now that he thought about it, how exactly had a war party of stone saints ended up on the forgotten shore? Had they been sent there by the demon of destiny during the war against the gods, ordered to guard the mortal realm that bordered the underworld? Or had they come there later, after the gods perished and their homeland was consumed by a flood of corruption? Sunny was more or less convinced that one of the 7 heroes of the Forgotten Stranger, the stranger, had been one of Nether's children, and a powerful one at that. Had Saint been one of his soldiers? There was no answer. Saint herself might remember, even if the memories of her past life were no more than a distant dream now that she had died and become a shadow. But she was not very talkative, to say the least. Outside the great mirror, that was, in any case, she might have been to this settlement once, a long time ago. This could have been her home, even, albeit Sunny doubted that. If it were, she would have probably shown more of a reaction. As the three of them drew close to the central square of the ruined settlement, Nephis shifted slightly and looked ahead. There are nightmare creatures nearby. Her voice was even but hid a hint of wariness. Sunny raised an eyebrow. How do you know? She lingered for a moment before answering. I can sense their corruption. Her sensitivity to the presence of nightmare creatures seemed to have become greater after she mastered the knowledge of corruption. Nightmare creatures. At this point, encountering a nightmare creature was almost a relief. Nightmare creatures were often terrifying and deadly opponents, and those who dwelled in the underworld were bound to be especially so, but at least they were a familiar foe. Sunny knew how to slay nightmare creatures, but eerie things born from true darkness or nothingness were beyond his field of expertise. True darkness and nothing. In fact, now that he thought about it, was it really a coincidence that there were only two powers that existed outside the framework of universal laws established by the gods, and Nether had come to wield both of them? Was there a hidden reason why the demon of destiny had established his domain in the hollow mountains of all places after his falling out with Storm God? The youngest daemons always had a rebellious streak, it seems. Just then they finally reached the central square. It was vast and austere, surrounded on all sides by a stream of flowing water. 4 bridges connected the settlement to the square, and at its center a great stele pierced the darkness like a sharp blade. There were deep, strangely familiar runes carved into the weathered surface of the stele, but at that moment Sunny paid them no attention. Instead, his attention was drawn to a circle of statues that surrounded the stele, facing outward as if to watch over the settlement. There were 7 of them. The statues were towering, almost as tall as Saint, each carved from stone with sublime mastery. They were statues of stone knights whose armor shared a similar design to Saint's fearsome suit of armor and to the jade mantle, even if theirs was simpler and less imposing. Their weapons, however, were different. The largest statue was leaning on an enormous greatsword, its head lowered, the plume of its helmet moving slightly in the wind. Ah, damn it. Sunny's expression fell. Obviously, a stone plume could not move, which meant that these statues were no statues at all, as 7 towering stone knights moved slowly, turning their heads in Saint's direction. He muttered a quiet curse. They were the nightmare creatures. They were corrupted stone saints. Chapter 3067, Fallen Saints. Despite having spent more than a decade fighting side by side with Saint, Sunny did not have a reference for how powerful the children of Nether were. Saint was merely one member of that fallen race, after all. Judging all her kin based on her personal prowess would have been akin to evaluating the strength of an ordinary human based on what someone like Sunny could do. But he suspected that the children of Nether had been quite formidable. Just a handful of them had been able to withstand all the horrors of the Forgotten Shore for thousands of years before finally being defeated and destroyed by other nightmare creatures. Even then, Sunny personally witnessed Saint slaying 2 abominations of a higher rank. That was something of a habit for him and the rest of the cohort, which skewed his perception a bit, but most awakened were different. So, he had known from the very start that Saint was exceptional, and she had been a mere awakened monster. The 7 towering knights in front of them, though, were all abominations of the great rank. 6 of them were demons, while the one wielding a greatsword was a devil. He did not know whether these fallen stone saints had all been supreme once, or if they had risen in rank over eons of defending the ruined settlement from the tides of darkness. But one thing was certain. They were dangerous enough for the creature of darkness that had attacked Sunny and Nephis at the pinnacle of the mountain to avoid disturbing these ancient warriors at least. Damn it! Sunny prepared for a fight. Nephis tensed as well regarding the stone-like abomination somberly. Saint, meanwhile, raised her shield. This time, too, she struck its rim twice, the solemn ringing echoing across the desolate square. A few moments later, for the first time, her challenge, or perhaps her call, was answered. The 7 great ones remained motionless for a heartbeat, then moved their weapons in unison. Those who wielded shields struck their rims, while others struck their breastplates, once, twice. The deep ringing sounded like thunder, banishing the silence that enveloped the ruined settlement. Only the great devil remained still, observing Saint with a dull gaze. There was nothing but deep, impenetrable darkness hiding behind the visor of his helmet, slowly igniting with chilling malice. Nephis, I know. Knowing that just a few moments later there would be no time to say anything, Sunny wanted to remind her of the nature of the finely crafted armaments that the stone saints wielded. He was not sure if Saint's other traits were shared by her fallen kin, but he was pretty confident that they possessed an immensely high resistance to elemental attacks, including to fire. Saint's resistance to elemental attacks could only be compared to her physical defenses, which were simply unmatched. Additionally, she was immune to mental and soul attacks, and while that might have been her personal trait, these abominations would be at least highly resistant to those kinds of blows. Stone saints were resilient beings, and Nef's flames were not going to damage them easily. However, she already knew that. After all, she could and had read Saint's runes. As for what precisely these abominations could do, luckily they had Cassie, and unlike the creature of darkness, the fallen stone saints were like an open book to her. It was just that relaying the information she glimpsed was going to take a few moments. Prepare to. Before Sunny could finish the sentence, he staggered. A debilitating feeling of powerlessness suddenly overwhelmed him, making him feel like his soul had been thrown into a deep and dark well. He knew the feeling well. It was the same feeling he experienced every time he entered Saint's field of annulment, and his powers were suppressed as a result, only this time it was even more powerful. Oh, come on! He was already more or less robbed of his aspect. Was there really a need to hit him with the power of nothingness on top of that, too? Beside him, Nephis seemed affected as well, her brilliant radiance dimming. The sphere of light she emanated shrank, plunging the steel and the 7 abominations surrounding it into impenetrable darkness. A split second later, the world quaked and exploded in a conflagration of violence as they moved to attack the invaders in unison. Sunny had been ready to face the 2 elements Saint commanded, elemental darkness and nothingness, but what assaulted them instead was a destructive combination of powers that enveloped them like a raging storm. In a brilliant flash of explosion, he glimpsed the fallen stone saints rushing forward to attack, their towering figures obscured by Saint's own. Behind the visor of one of them, orange flames danced, as if wishing to devour the world. A chilling mist flowed from beneath the armor of another, the stones around him becoming covered by a layer of ice. The third had turned into a towering wave, rushing forward like a devastating flood. The fourth commanded the stone plates of the square itself, turning them into a deadly mire. One more seemed to have pierced space itself, appearing behind Sunny and Nephis in the blink of an eye. And at the same moment, one of the children of Nether had already reached Saint, as if time was flowing differently for him. What? Each of the fallen stone saints wielded their own unique set of powers, relying on different source elements to destroy the enemy. But only one of them seemed to embody nothingness. It was the great devil who wielded the great sword, the only one of the 7 abominations who had not moved yet. Fighting these abominations was no different from fighting Awakened, each wielding a powerful aspect despite their classes. And although those aspects alone were deadly, it was the physical might and martial prowess of the children of Nether that had made them truly terrifying. In the next moment, 6 of them descended upon Sunny, Nephis, and Saint in an obliterating whirlwind of stone-like metal. Chapter 3068, Tainted Jade. It all happened quickly. One moment, the children of Nether were motionless. The next moment, the square exploded in a storm of violence, its silence torn apart and swallowed by the deafening thunder of breaking stone. 6 of the fallen stone saints attacked. The 7th, their leader, remained motionless, still leaning on his great sword. The darkness hiding behind the visor of his helmet was cold and boundless, full of chilling malice. The power of nothingness he wielded washed over Sunny and Nephis, sapping them of strength. Saint, meanwhile, seemed unaffected. She activated the Shield of Nothing, stealing power from her fallen kin as well. Her power was similar to that of the great devil, but there was a distinction between them. The enemy seemed to harbor a far greater amount of nothingness, and therefore the effect of his nullification was more potent. He was capable of using it with greater precision as well. After all, he had suppressed Sunny and Nephis without affecting his own companions. Saint's field of annulment, however, did not make a distinction between friend or foe. So, when the Shield of Nothing activated, Sunny and Nephis fell victim to its denial too. Needless to say, it was an unpleasant experience. But Sunny understood her logic. Their powers were already being suppressed, so adding more pressure was not going to make that large a difference. More than that, there were only 3 members in their small and daring expedition force, so 2/3 of it was being suppressed. There were 7 fallen stone saints attacking them, though. So when Saint activated the Shield of Nothing, 6/7 of the enemy force suffered from being denied their power. The math worked, even if it was counterintuitive. More importantly, there was a very practical reason why Saint needed to call upon nothingness. It was the swiftest of the 7 great abominations. Each of them wielded power over a single source element, and this one seemed to control time itself. He forced time to flow faster around him, while at the same time slowing its current around Saint. As a result, in the blink of an eye, his spear was already a split second away from slipping into the thin crack between her helmet and her gorget, plunging straight into her neck. When the field of annulment washed over the world, that power was denied, not entirely suppressed perhaps, but definitely made weaker. That slowed the swift abomination just enough for Saint to lean to the side and avoid the tip of the spear, then push it away with her shield. At the same time, her sword lashed forward. Saint used the enemy's speed against him, leveraging it to increase the deadly force of her tenebrous blade. In the next moment, something soared into the air in a swiftly expanding cloud of ruby dust. It was a spinning helmet with a narrow visor, its plume trailing behind like a torrent of darkness. She had beheaded one of the 7 fallen stone saints. The spell whispered into Sunny's ear, "You have slain a great demon, Saint of Tainted Jade." Just like that, the 7 enemies had become 6. The remaining 6, though, dealing with them was not going to be easy. One of the great abominations seemed to wield a spatial power, having used it to instantly appear behind Nephis and Sunny. His warhammer was already falling down, threatening to squash Nephis like a bug. The size difference between them was vast, after all. The fallen stone saint was almost 10 meters tall, while Nephis was merely a human. On top of that, the attack had come unexpectedly and from behind her, leaving her little time to react. She still sensed it, though. No matter how strong and fast the fallen stone saints were, Nephis was stronger and faster. She was a supreme titan, after all, augmented by the full power of her aspect. So, she managed to turn around and raise the radiant blade of the blessing to block the obliterating blow of the abomination's warhammer. Then, however, something strange happened. Space seemed to ripple, and the abomination's weapon bypassed the blessing entirely. It did not break it, and neither did it pass through it. Instead, the black warhammer simply danced through twisted space, avoiding Neph's block and landing squarely on her chest. The power of that blow was so devastating that she was flung hundreds of meters away, landing in a bloody mess of broken bones on the other end of the square. Neph's body slid across the cold stones, leaving a bloody trail in its wake. Then, however, white flames blazed from her ghastly wounds, washing over her, and she began to rise. Sunny could not observe that, though, because he found himself in a precarious situation. He had been intending to turn into a shadow and wrap himself around Nephis, empowering her, but the attack of the space-bending abomination came too swiftly. Now, not only was he too far away to augment her, but when Nephis was flung away, her radiance also disappeared, plunging his surroundings into complete darkness. Sunny was suddenly blind, his powers utterly stifled, and surrounded by immensely powerful great nightmare creatures to boot. He cursed inwardly. Well, great. What was he supposed to do now? Should I just die? Hell, why not? Sunny probably had a second before the same warhammer that had broken Nephis like a doll and sent her flying across the square came down on his head. Of course, unlike Nephis, he was wearing armor, and a dreadfully tough one at that. But that was the thing about warhammers. Their whole purpose was to deal with heavily armored opponents, and their beaks were designed to break through things that swords and spears could not pierce. If Saint turned her head, Sunny would be able to see his enemy through her eyes and dodge. But considering how deftly the bastard twisted space, he doubted that dodging the incoming blow would be easy or even possible. Usually, Sunny would use Shadow Step in such a situation, but there were no shadows around him, so he couldn't. He could not use Shadow Manifestation either. Even his most fundamental powers were weakened and suppressed by nothingness. Half a second left. Sunny raised his head, staring blindly in the direction where he thought the fallen stone saint was looming above him. At that moment, a bold idea surfaced in his mind. Yeah, let's try that. Chapter 3069. Shadow of Flame. The moment Sunny saw the fallen children of Nether, all of the great rank, he could not help but think about the connection between them and Saint, and his own connection to them as well. He was wearing the jade mantle, a memory of one of the 7 suits of armor the demon of choice had crafted for his most cherished creations. Because of that armor, and because of Saint, who was one of Sunny's swordsmanship teachers, he had always shared a connection to the children of Nether. That connection had culminated in the battle against the puppeteer, allowing him to assume the form of the Jade Titan, a supreme Titan form of a stone saint. So Sunny instinctively thought about assuming that form again. But what was the point? He could use Shadow Dance to mimic some of Saint's traits, but he could not mimic her authority over elemental darkness. True darkness and shadows were too diametrically opposed after all, preventing him from embodying that facet of his taciturn shadow, and without mastery of true darkness, he would still be blind and powerless even if he turned himself into the Jade Titan. However, the idea of using Shadow Dance to escape this deadly predicament felt like the right solution, in and of itself. After all, with most of his abilities suppressed and no shadows around him, the only shadow at his disposal was his own, and that was all he needed to perform the steps of Shadow Dance. What really made Sunny think about it, though, were the fallen stone saints themselves. He had always assumed that Saint wielded power over true darkness and nothingness, simply because that was the innate path of evolution for those of her kind. In his mind, the stone saints all started off wielding no mystical powers, and then gained the same ones as they climbed the classes. Perhaps there was variety in how they expressed that affinity, but the foundation was the same. Witnessing these 7 great abominations, however, had proven him wrong. Each of them controlled a unique element: heat, cold, water, stone, space, time, nothingness. Only Saint wielded 2, nothingness and true darkness. Remembering the peculiar nature of how she had reached higher classes, a bold theory surfaced in his mind. What if Saint had evolved after slaying certain opponents, not because that was the only way she could evolve, but because she chose them? Humans possessed aspects, while nightmare creatures gained profane powers that were innate to their tribes. What about the stone saints, then? The stone saints did not possess aspects, but what if they could design and assemble their own approximations of aspects? That was why, as the stone saints grew in power, each of them ended up wielding a unique set of abilities. They were innately capable of accommodating different source elements, and even if their kind shared an innate affinity to some of them, they could consciously develop any affinity they wanted over time. He could not explain why these 7 abominations all possessed drastically different powers otherwise, especially because only one of them was a devil, which meant that the rest were not supposed to have any profane powers at all. So then, how did that help him in the current situation? Sunny was about to find out if it did. With just a split second remaining before the crushing blow descended upon him, Sunny exhaled and focused on channeling the essence of the Jade Titan. He was very familiar with Saint and her powers, having fought side by side with her for a dozen years, and having felt what it means to be her on top of that. So he shadowed Saint while at the same time reshaping his will to resemble hers, channeling the concept of the Jade Titan through himself. However, this time, Sunny took it a step further. If his theory that the stone saints could build a semblance of aspects within themselves, and that Saint had chosen to contain dual source elements within herself, Sunny did the same. The first source element he embodied was obvious. It was shadows. The second one was more peculiar. It belonged to someone whom Sunny knew even better than he knew Saint. Someone whom he had known longer and closer than even his most loyal shadow. It was Nephis. Sunny knew Nephis better than anyone else. She had been his first teacher, laying the foundation of his future swordsmanship. It was in a battle against her that he had mastered the first step of Shadow Dance. He had been healed by her flames. He had been burned by them as well. Most importantly, he shared a bond with Nephis, the Shadow Bond. Because of Shadow Bond, Sunny had been able to augment Nephis and learn how it felt to be her. He had been augmented by her flames in turn, learning the taste of their ferocious power. In fact, he had known that taste for a long time. Many years ago, locked in the endless revolutions of Alethia's island, He had used the mirror of truth to mirror Nif's soul flame ability. He remembered that experience well. And his lightless soul, too, burned with the flame of divinity. So even if he did not possess the fire, nothing prevented him from trying to shadow her aspect, to shadow soul flame. And that was what Sunny did. Channeling the concept of the Jade Titan, he imbued it with the dual power of shadows and light. In the next moment, his human form collapsed into a torrent of shadows and reformed anew, turning into a towering stone colossus. His body became stone-like and impossibly durable, the jade mantle encasing it like an impregnable carapace. His blood turned into ruby dust. His heart became an immolating furnace that contained brilliant divine flame. But that was not all. A moment later, a blinding white radiance blazed from beneath the visor of his helmet, spilling through the cracks of his armor. That radiance pushed away the darkness. Casting deep shadows on the cracked stones of the vast square, Sunny saw his enemy, and the sharp beak of the warhammer flashing through twisted space to crush him. A moment later, he caught the head of the hammer with an iron grip. Chapter 3070 Mystical Tactics. Sunny had become a towering colossus, his imposing figure encased in a suit of fearsome armor. Blinding radiance shone from beneath the jade mantle, illuminating the shattered stones around him. A moment later, he caught the fallen stone saint's warhammer in an iron grip. Actually, Sunny first made a sidestep to avoid the blow, but immediately after the space around him twisted, placing him square in the path of the enemy's weapon once again. But, having expected that, counted on that. In fact, he managed to catch the warhammer just in time. That was true mastery of combat, after all. Not only following the cadence of battle, but dictating it. Sunny knew the Children of Nether well, so he could easily read what his opponent would do from the movements of his shadow. Right now, for example, the abomination was not at all rattled by the failure of his blow. Instead, the fallen stone saint immediately pressed the attack, intending to slam the rim of his shield into Sunny's helmet. Steady. Pulling the warhammer to throw the enemy off balance, Sunny bent to avoid the devastating shield. Now that he had become a source of light, there were shadows on the fractured ground. Reaching into them, he pulled a sharp sword out of the darkness. A moment later, the blade of the black sword swelled with brilliant radiance. Pushing the true darkness further away with that, his luck had run out. The Space Saint had fathomed the unexpected transformation of his prey and changed his stance, leaving Sunny no openings. The Children of Nether were already terribly durable, their armor very tough to breach, and with the addition of a shield, getting past all their defenses seemed all but impossible. Will it work, I wonder? Instead of trying to bypass the enemy's shield and find a crack in his armor, Sunny pushed forward, sidestepped, and plunged his shining sword into the abomination's shadow. As soon as he did, the fallen stone saint shuddered, and a fountain of ruby dust exploded from within his helmet. "You have slain a great demon." Saint was immune to soul attacks, and her kin were bound to be at least highly resistant to them. However, what Sunny attacked was not the creature's soul, but its shadow. He wasn't sure if the distinction would matter, but it did, and a calamitous result at that. Very few beings knew how to guard their shadows. 5 to go. Sunny spun in a rush to come to Saint's aid. By then the 4 great demons had reached her, unleashing a storm of devastating attacks. Ice covered the joints of her armor, slowing her movements down. At the same time, the stones beneath her feet turned into a mire, pulling her down and trying to trap her. A devastating flood of inky black water crashed into her, and a moment later a towering figure whose visor burned with infernal flames broke through it, the tip of his radiant sword a split second away from piercing Saint's armor, or at least attempting to pierce it. At the same time, the crushing wave twisted, turning into a second stone-like abomination. That one had already passed Saint, ready to deliver a second lethal blow from the side. Slowed down, immobilized, Saint had little hope of evading either attack. She could try to block one with her shield and deflect the other with her sword. Instead, she turned into a torrent of darkness and rushed past the Fire Saint, assuming her material form far behind him, near the abomination who had encased her armor in a layer of debilitating ice. Her sword plummeted down like the blade of a guillotine, landing on the base of the fallen stone saint's neck. This time she failed to behead the enemy, but she did breach their armor, dealing the abomination a deep wound. By then the miraculous flames had already mended Neph's broken body, leaving it pristine and brimming with incinerating power. Despite being separated from the battle by the vast span of the square, she raised the blessing and pointed its tip forward. In the next moment, a ray of pure white light shot from the radiant sword, instantly breaching the distance between her and the enemy. Her aim wasn't precise enough to take out any of the fallen children of Nether, but it did paint the square in a stark combination of white and black, allowing Sunny to step through the shadows and appear next to Saint. Now, it was the two of them against four great demons. Sunny quite liked these odds. The ruined settlement quaked and collapsed as the battle raged on, each second summoning indescribable destruction into the world. While battling the fallen stone saints, Sunny swiftly came to realize a fascinating detail about how they fought. That detail had to do with their indomitable, malevolent will. What made these abominations so deadly was not only their fearsome power, their daunting resilience, and their sublime armaments. It was also their martial skill and the fact that they not only possessed potent wills, but also effortlessly expressed them as a collective instead of individuals. As a result, the combined power of their wills was far more formidable and oppressive than it was meant to be. Possessing a powerful will and knowing how to express it were entirely different skills. The latter was the core of supreme battle arts, which incorporated will techniques into one's martial style. Sunny and Nephis had been developing their own supreme battle arts for quite some time now, but it was not something that could be accomplished with only training and ingenuity. Perfecting a supreme battle art demanded time and experience, and while Sunny and Nephis were powerful, they had only been supreme for a few years. They had not reached the level of combat mastery the King of Swords and the Queen of Worms had possessed, as far as expressing their will in refined ways was concerned. Sovereigns were solitary beings by definition, and great nightmare creatures did not usually possess enough sanity to employ strategy and showcase refined skill. So this was the first time Sunny saw a collective will technique, and such a seamless one at that. This was not even a supreme battle art. This was more akin to weaving the will into a tactical formation. Even as Sunny fought for his life against the fallen stone saints, he was absorbing their singular skill like a sponge. He was thrilled to see such a profound and startling will technique in action. But mostly, he was concerned with how to survive it. Chapter 3071. Limits of Strength. The children of Nether were powerful, supremely skilled and fierce. They wielded their powers with profound mastery, and their will washed over the devastated square like a tide. Fighting them felt like fighting Saint. Theirs was a grounded, methodical, and indomitable battle style. It revealed the depths of their malevolent resolve and felt suffocating in its relentless inevitability. However, today they had met their match. Sunny, Nephis, and Saint were overwhelmingly powerful themselves. In fact, it was astonishing that a group of great nightmare creatures could pressure them, having always fought across ranks. Sunny had grown used to only being wary of cursed abominations. A great nightmare creature had to be at least a terror to make him feel tense. For now their strength was evenly matched. But that was only because the great devil who commanded the other tainted saints had not joined the battle yet. He was still motionless, observing the battle while resting his greatsword on the ground. Sunny was waiting for the moment when the eerie abominations would attack with somber anticipation, knowing that they would suffer as a result. But even as the battle progressed, the devil remained still. And because he did not move, his warriors fell one by one. The Fire Saint was the most fearsome and devastating among them, his flames capable of melting steel and turning stone into rivers of lava. However, he was also the unluckiest, and luck too dictated the limits of one's strength. It would be difficult to find three enemies he was less suited to fight. Saint was extremely resistant to all elemental attacks, after all, so she was all but impervious to his flames. Sunny, meanwhile, had assumed the form of the Jade Titan, inheriting the same resilient trait. Naturally, there was no point in even mentioning Nephis. As a supreme titan who had inherited the fire of Sun God, trying to burn her was an exercise in futility. So the Fire Saint fell first. Saint caught him mid-swing, throwing the towering abomination off balance and sending him crashing to the ground with a push of her shield. Then she destroyed him in the most brutal fashion. Knowing that the enemy would protect the weak points of his armor even while prone, she simply raised her shield and repeatedly brought it down on his helmet. After the first blow, the helmet bent. After the second, it cracked. After the third, it exploded into a cloud of shrapnel, stone fragments, and ruby dust. The Fire Saint's head was entirely crushed. The Ice Saint had not fared much better. This one had a slimmer figure, unmistakably female. Her power was both potent and insidious, capable of rendering most terrible foes weak and vulnerable. However, the lethal cold she emanated was easily vanquished by Nef's immolating heat. In some ways, she was even worse off than the Fire Saint in this battle. Her power was not only ineffective against the enemy, it was directly countered by one of them. She fell second. Nifis unleashed her flames to envelop the Ice Saint, and even if her armor managed to withstand the impossible heat, it began to glow with incandescent radiance, having turned softer and weaker. Saint used that weakness to pierce her fallen kin's chest, ending her profane existence with one decisive strike. The third of the tainted saints, who commanded stone, faced Sunny. His power was formidable and profoundly versatile, but its main application was denying the enemy sure footing, which of course was a death sentence on most battlefields, where footwork and the ability to push against the earth to generate force reigned. Sunny, however, had become both a source of light and a champion of shadows. As long as there were shadows around him, he could step through them to avoid being caught in the trap of liquid stone. He could also summon more of them from the shadow lantern and manifest them into a layer of matter atop the ground. His enemy could have shifted to a different strategy, most likely, but Sunny did not give him the chance. After witnessing the death of the Space Saint, the rest of them knew to guard their shadows, so this time he simply used brute force to bat the opponent's shield aside and drive his sword into his unprotected armpit. That might not have been a fatal wound, but it became one when Sunny infused the blade of his sword with death will. The Water Saint was the last to die. She was swift and elusive, both fleeting and devastating, but her tidal form could not contend against Nef's flame and the power granted to Saint by Sunny's augmentation. In the end, she was diminished by the heat, caged by the shadows, and killed by Sunny's slaying blade. All four could have unleashed far more devastation, if not for the field of annulment summoned by Saint. But then again, the same could be said about Sunny and Nifis. If their powers weren't suppressed, it wouldn't be just the square of the crumbling settlement that had ended up utterly destroyed. It would have been the settlement itself. The square had become a scene of chilling devastation, but the tall obelisk at its center still stood. The last of the tainted saints still stood in the shadow of the obelisk as well. In truth, the battle was over at this point. No matter how powerful that great devil was, he could not be powerful enough to win against Sunny, Nifis, and Saint. More than that, Sunny had not used all of his powers. If he wished to, he could have swayed the scales of battle in their favor even earlier. All 6 of the children of Nether had been slain by him or Saint, after all. That meant that their shades were now under his command. The rest of the Shadow Legion was engaged in the war against the Barrow Wraiths on the Forgotten Shore, but these new recruits could be summoned at any time, and yet he did not summon them. In fact, after receiving a dark look from Saint, he remained motionless and held Nefis back as well. Saint walked toward the last defender of the crumbling settlement with confident steps. It seemed that she wanted to bring down this great devil, her equal, alone. Chapter 3072. Stalwart Beings. A supreme devil was preparing to challenge a great devil. Both of them were children of Nether, even if the vicissitudes of history had led them to different paths. Saint was a shadow now, while her adversary was a nightmare creature. Their battle could end swiftly or rage for a long time, but either way, it was going to leave a bitter taste. Sunny hesitated for a few moments, then chose to respect Saint's wishes and called his second incarnation back. Devoid of his support, she would only be able to rely on her own power in the clash against this fearsome foe. Sunny could not say that he wasn't worried, but he wasn't worried that much either. It would take more than a great devil to shake his confidence in Saint standing by his side. Nefis frowned, but made no move to attack the devil. She seemed to understand the poignant meaning of this clash. Saint had not shown any doubt or hesitation when slaying the rest of the children of Nether. In fact, she had been especially cold and ruthless while dealing with them, but now it was apparent that she did view this battle as special. Both she and her enemy wielded power over nothingness, so there was no telling how their clash would go. But what transpired next was entirely beyond Sunny's expectations. Something strange happened when Saint approached. The great devil finally moved. He had remained motionless before, even when his kin were being killed, but now the towering colossus slowly removed one of his hands from the hilt of his immense sword. Sunny frowned. There was something odd about how the tainted saint moved. His movements were strained and unsure, as if he were bearing an impossible weight. The great devil and saint were still for a few long moments, looking at each other in cold silence. There were crimson flames burning behind the visor of Saint's helmet, while the helmet of her enemy only brimmed with darkness. Then the tainted saint slowly raised his hand, and brought it down upon the blade of his great sword, shattering it. As the shards of the giant blade fell to the ground, he arduously lowered himself to one knee and looked up, peering at Saint. Their silence seemed to say a lot, infused with unknown meaning. Saint lingered for a few moments, then lowered her head slightly in a nod. A moment later, her sword flashed forward, its blade plunging into the narrow crack of the tainted saint's visor. It tore through the back of his helmet next. This time there was no ruby dust spilling from the black blade. The great devil swayed. Then his armor collapsed and fell apart, as if there had never been anything inside it at all. The spell whispered into Sunny's ear. "You have slain a great devil, Absence. Your shadow grows stronger. The battle is over." Sunny stared at the empty suit of armor with a stunned expression. He released the jade titan form, turning back into a human. What just happened? In front of him, Saint stared at the remains of the great devil, motionless. She leaned down, picked up his helmet, and silently placed it at the base of the towering steel. Sunny looked at Nephis. Did that nightmare creature just surrender? Nephis did not answer for a few moments, then shook her head. He did not surrender. Sunny frowned. If the great devil had not surrendered, then why had he allowed Saint to kill him without a fight? His movements had seemed strained, as if he was struggling against something. An impossible suspicion settled in Sunny's mind. He hesitated for a long while, unsure if he could even believe in something so far-fetched. But no matter how he thought about it, the suspicion only grew stronger. Was he resisting? Corruption? It was strange that the great devil had remained motionless throughout the entire battle, even when the other tainted saints were being slain. All he had done was subject Nephis, Sunny, and Saint to the power of annulment. But if he had been resisting the urge to attack them that whole time, fighting a silent battle within himself, his actions suddenly had meaning. That devil had not held himself back because of Sunny or Nephis, most likely. Rather, he must have recognized Saint as a member of their kind, the last child of Nether who walked the earth free of corruption, even if it was as a shadow. She was a stone saint who had reached supremacy while walking the path of ascension, and therefore had deserved his recognition. So the great devil chose to resist in the last moments of his life, rebelling against his very nature. Sunny had never met a nightmare creature who could deny the demented frenzy of corruption even for a little bit. The puppeteer came the closest, albeit in the case of the spirit of doubt, that resistance was nothing more than pretense meant to lull its enemies into lowering their guard. However, the stone saints were stalwart beings. There was hardly anyone more stalwart. In fact, it was their unshakable resolve that made them immune to mental attacks. So if anyone could push back the power of corruption for a few fleeting moments, it was them. Sunny looked at the remains of the great devil, feeling a hint of begrudging respect. He sighed deeply, then turned to Nephis. "Are you all right?" The blow of a tainted saint's war hammer had nearly destroyed her supreme body. The harrowing wounds might have healed, washed away by her miraculous flames, but the pain both of being crushed by the enemy's blow and of being restored must have burdened her. Nephis nodded. "I'm fine." She lingered for a moment, then looked around. "We might not be fine, though." These abominations were probably keeping the creature of darkness away from the settlement, but now that they are gone, we are exposed. Sunny studied her quietly. That is not entirely a problem. Some distance away, Saint was standing beneath the towering black obelisk, looking up at the runes carved into its surface in solemn silence. Then, however, the darkness around her moved. 7 towering figures rose from the shadows, assembling into a wedge formation behind her. They were the shades of the tainted saints. The shadow of the stalwart great devil was among them as well. Now, these fallen creations of Nether were Saint's soldiers. Chapter 30730, I Asked the Darkness. Saint had a cohort of subordinate supreme demons now, and even a capable supreme devil for lieutenant. Not only that, but the shadows of tainted saints had spent thousands of years defending the crumbling settlements from the beings that dwelled in true darkness. That was good news for Sunny, who had a feeling that their journey into the depths of the underworld would be an eventful one. They had only just entered it, after all, and already sustained countless wounds. Who knew what would happen in the coming weeks as they delved deeper into this dark realm? One thing was certain. There would be more battles, more danger, and more wounds. It was not all bad, though. There were powerful shades to be gained, and Sunny tended to achieve impactful breakthroughs under pressure. He had deepened his mastery of shadow dance just now, for example, and there was still room for improvement. Now that he had regained his true name, it served as an anchor. He did not have to fear losing himself anymore, at least not as much, which allowed him to be bolder in his exploration of shadow dance. The progress was already significant back on Alethia's island. When Sunny mirrored Nef's soul flame with the help of the Mirror of Truth, the summoned flames had been lightless and black, reflecting the true nature of his soul. This time, however, they were pure and radiant, proving that he shadowed Nef's soul and the essence of her fiery power, not just its outward function. Considering that he had needed light, that was a vital distinction. I am still lacking something, though. At some point in the past, Sunny had believed that the 6th step of shadow dance was about channeling the concept of a being and reshaping his will to flawlessly mimic its will, its spirit. However, his opinion had evolved since then. Channeling concepts and bending the will was still an important part of mastering shadow dance, but it was a means to an end, not a milestone, a tool to help him take the next step, not the step itself. Looking back, he should have realized it sooner. Otherwise, the 6th step of shadow dance would have only been useful against deities, which went against the innate versatility of shadows, which were meant to follow all beings. Sunny had always had a clear picture of shadow dance before. Once a new step was mastered, its essence became apparent. But now he felt like he was missing a crucial detail. The 5th step was meant to allow him to shadow the attributes of other beings, while the 6th step was meant to shadow their aspects and powers. Sunny had been learning these steps without the helpful assistance of the nightmare spell, so they became mixed and entangled in his mind. The 5th step had been mastered, but felt incomplete. Sunny could shadow some attributes, perhaps even most of them, but not all of them. The 6th step had partially revealed itself to him, but was not fully mastered. Sunny could shadow Saint, but could not control true darkness. He could shadow Nephis, but not her fire. Something was still lacking, and he was starting to suspect that what he was lacking was mastery of the final 7th step of Shadow Step. That step had to be the thread that tied it all together and completed his aspect legacy. The 5th, the 6th, and the 7th steps seemed inexplicably linked, as if they were 3 parts of the same whole. Sunny had no idea what the 7th step entailed, though he would have to consider it later. I still made good progress today, though, Sunny sighed. Around him, the crumbling settlement of the stone saints stood silent. Sunny and Nephis had already rested after the intense battle, while Saint had spent that time tending to the remains of her fallen kin. Now it was time to continue the journey. Before that, however, there was one thing left to do. Sunny and Nephis walked toward the towering stele that stood in the center of the square. The square had been decimated, but the black obelisk still stood, unscathed and undamaged by the ferocious battle. There on its surface, a weave of runes that felt strangely familiar was cut into the ancient stone. As they walked closer and Neph's radiance illuminated the runes, Sunny finally understood where the peculiar feeling of familiarity had come from. They resembled the runes carved into the walls of the ebony tower. One's Nether had seemingly carved into the surface of unbreakable stone with his fingernail. The obelisk that stood in the heart of the crumbling settlement bore the writing of the demon of choice. Raising his head, Sunny studied the runes, wondering what message Nether had left behind. What he saw was surprising. The runes read, "While following the paths that shadows tread, I came upon a dismal, empty land. It was a realm devoid of life, forlorn and lightless. There darkness reigned. I asked the darkness, 'What is death?' The darkness answered, 'Peace.' Death swallows all, embraces all, brings peace to all. Death is bliss." I laughed then, looking at its onyx throne, and told the darkness lies. For that was not the case. Death swallows all, brings peace to all, but I'm refused its grace. The darkness sighed. Its voice was hollow like regret, it told me. Even gods know sin. All things have flaws, and so does death. Forgive me, child. The darkness pitied me, it seemed. I looked at death then in its dismal land. I pitied it as well. Death swallowed all, brought peace to all. But who could swallow death? Are we the same then, God of peace? The darkness did not speak, and so I raised my voice. If no one pities death, I will. If death refuses me, I won't. I shall grow strong and vast, far greater than your lightless realm, and then, one day I'll come to swallow you, O death. That is my choice. Sunny stared at the runes with a pensive expression on his face. What? Was this a poem about death? An ode to darkness? No. It was a record of a conversation between the demon of destiny and death, between the prince of the underworld and shadow god, chapter 3074, Prince of the Underworld. Sunny realized that the ancient runes had been left behind by Nether after reading the first few lines. Why else would the stone saints build their settlement around the towering black obelisk, guarding it even as they were consumed by corruption? The identity of the author was no mystery. As Sunny read further, however, his expression gradually changed. At first, he assumed that the darkness Nether spoke to was a metaphorical personification of true darkness, or a powerful creature of darkness, perhaps. After all, the crumbling settlement was located in the underworld, which Nether had once claimed as his realm, so having a conversation with the elemental force dwelling in the underworld would seem appropriate. But as soon as death and peace were mentioned, Sunny realized that in the context of this conversation, the darkness could only represent one being, Shadow God, the god of peace and solace. That instantly got his attention. In the writings left on the walls of the ebony tower, Nether asked, "What is life?" And in the poem carved into this black obelisk, he was asking, "What is death?" The demon of destiny had been quite interested in philosophy, it seemed. But actually there was a very interesting detail hidden in Nether's poem that had nothing to do with his question, or even with Shadow God himself. It was there in the very first line. While following the paths that shadows tread, Sunny tilted his head a little. It seemed that the poem described a journey Nether, a much younger version of him than the fearsome prince of the underworld most likely had undertaken once. He explored the underworld and in the process became intrigued by the shadows of the dead that crossed that realm of elemental darkness to make their way to the Shadow Realm. So he followed, braving the abyss to find Shadow God's throne. That was actually something Sunny had always been confused about. The ancient people seemed to have believed that the shadows of the dead went on a literal journey, physically traveling to the underworld, traveling through its dark depths, and finally reaching their destination after descending into the abyss. But Sunny had never been sure if that was merely a superstitious belief or a literal fact. If the journey of the shadows was a metaphor or an expression of universal laws, now it seemed he had a confirmation. According to Nether, it was true. However, nothing of the sort was happening today. Sunny did not know how the shadows of the dead reached the Shadow Realm, but it seemed to happen almost instantaneously, without the need to go on an arduous journey. So, what changed? He considered the strange dichotomy for a few moments, then looked back to the obelisk with a surprised expression. The answer seems obvious, doesn't it? It was because the world was not the same. Before, the shadows had to travel from the realm where they had perished to the realm of death, and that journey took some time to complete. Now, however, there were no realms. There was only the dream realm. The shadow realm had long become a part of it, so the shadows did not have to travel far to reach it. Fascinating. Sunny did not know how that information could be useful to him, but still felt a hint of excitement simply because he had solved a new mystery. Shadow God had not only been the god of peace and solace, he had been the god of mysteries as well. Was that why Sunny could never sate his curiosity? Shaking his head lightly, he turned his attention back to the ancient runes. Lies? It was quite bold of Nether to have accused Shadow God of being a liar, but it revealed a greater truth. Sunny knew that the demon of destiny, and by extension all other daemons, had felt some degree of anguish because of the prohibition placed on them by the gods, because they were forbidden from siring offspring. In that way their claim to life had been crippled. But it seemed that at some point Nether had learned that daemons were refused the right to die as well. It all came down to the question Sunny himself had asked the demon of desire in the second nightmare. Why had Sun God chosen to imprison Hope instead of destroying her? It was because daemons were children of the forgotten god. According to Weaver, if Weaver could be trusted, daemons could not die. They could only be destroyed, and in the act of being destroyed, the essence of what made them individuals would be returned to the forgotten god, making him stronger and closer to awakening from slumber. The forgotten god was the flaw of existence, and daemons were the flaw of the gods. That was what Cassie saw in one of the memories she had inherited, at least. Now that Sunny studied Nether's poem, however, he saw the plight of demons in a different light. If death was peace, if it brought everyone the final solace, then didn't that mean that the demons had been refused peace as well, while at the same time enduring the dire prohibition placed on their lives? No wonder Nether had eventually rebelled against the gods. That happened long after this conversation with Shadow God, though. During this conversation, Nether had still been young and did not seem to harbor negative feelings toward Shadow God. And yet Nether had promised to destroy him. That proclamation wasn't made with malice. Rather, it seemed like mercy. Nether had been denied death, so he promised to bring death to another being carrying the same curse. Death was an aspect of Shadow God, after all. The Shadow Realm was his body. He swallowed the shadows of the dead and dismantled them into pure soul essence within himself. So how could Shadow God die? He couldn't swallow himself, so Nether offered to one day devour the god of death as a favor. How cocky of him. Sunny shook his head in amazement. He wasn't sure how much of the poem was a factual retelling of a real conversation between Shadow God and Nether, and how much of it was a literary interpretation. However, it was clear that Nether had a complicated relationship with the great gods long before his rebellion. Was Shadow God the reason why he had chosen to conquer the underworld and subjugate true darkness? True darkness was what shadows feared, after all. If Nether wanted to keep his promise, absorbing it and nothingness as well would have been a profound first step. He failed, though. In the end, neither true darkness nor the power of nothingness had managed to destroy the gods. Instead, they had been consumed by the nightmare spell. It wasn't Nether who had slain them, it was Weaver. So in a sense, the only power that could destroy the gods was fate, and it was precisely that power that Weaver had wanted to defeat as well. Chapter 3075. Subterranean River. Sunny and Nephis did not stay in the crumbling settlement for long. He would have loved to explore it, but sadly the area wasn't safe. These were still the hunting grounds of the creature of darkness they had encountered before, and with the tainted saints gone, nothing was keeping it away from the settlement anymore. Usually Sunny would have swept the entire place with his shadow sense. But now he could only perceive a small area where light fell, which limited what he could do. There was no guarantee that the creature of darkness would not follow them wherever they went, or that they would not encounter other, even more harrowing beings of its kind, but they had to press on no matter what perils the underworld had in store for them. Leaving the devastated square behind, they traversed the streets of the ancient settlement. Soon the quiet murmur of water grew louder, and they reached the shore of an underground river. The river was wide and deep, its cold waters flowing like a torrent of liquid darkness. Nef's light could not permeate their depths, scattering across the surface. Because of that, Sunny felt like he was looking at an ancient mirror reflecting nothing but a vast, starless sky. He studied the river for a short while, then glanced at Nephis. "This is a tributary of one of the 3 great rivers of the underworld," she nodded. "It should be." Sunny hesitated for a moment. "Then our path is decided, isn't it? We can follow the tributary to the main river, then move upstream until we find the capital of Nether's kingdom." It was a decent plan. Inwardly, though, Sunny felt quite dejected. I hate water. Why was he always stuck having to dive into creepy, dark bodies of water? Sunny shook his head. Nevertheless, he looked at the subterranean river with curiosity. Where did these rivers come from, and where did they flow to? There was no way to tell. He wondered if the lethal currents that rushed through the countless canyons of Moon River Plains and eventually gave birth to the River of Tears came from the underworld. Someone smarter than me will find out one day. Moon River Plains were far away in the southwestern direction. Sunny and Nephis, however, had to travel north, deeper into the underworld, so he would not have a chance to find out. They were ready to leave the settlement. Saint reduced her weight and took a step off a stone pier, walking across the river as if nothing was the matter. The surface tension of the water was enough to support her weight. Sunny had all manner of ways to traverse the river, while Nephis could fly. However, doing so would require her to constantly channel her aspect, and therefore endure the agony of her flaw. So instead, Sunny assumed the form of the Jade Titan once more. Back on the square, he had kept his size similar to that of his enemies. Being bigger was not always an advantage, especially when facing skilled opponents of high ranks. Now, however, Sunny unleashed his shadow from the narrow confines of a human shape, allowing it to wash over the world like a dark tide. Then he shaped himself into the true, colossal form of the Jade Titan, easily 200 meters in height, towering above the crumbling settlements like a dark deity. Stepping into the river, Sunny caused it to seethe and foam around his colossal ankle, spilling from its shores. He took another step, walking deeper into the river. In the end, when he reached its deepest part, water only reached his waist. Nephis landed on his shoulder, looking at the current of dark water from great height. She dismissed the blessing, extinguishing its brilliant light at the same moment, however. Blinding radiance ignited behind the visor of Sunny's helmet, illuminating the river like a powerful searchlight and turning him into a walking lighthouse. He pushed his unfathomable weight forward, displacing a great mass of water and raising towering waves. Saint moved far ahead, skating on the surface of the river, to scout the way. That was how the 3 of them left the settlement of the Children of Nether and journeyed into the depths of the underworld. Their journey was not an easy one. The underworld was vast, and unlike all other regions of the Dream Realm, it wasn't teeming with nightmare creatures. However, those nightmare creatures that did dwell in its lightless depths were all utterly horrifying. There were abominations dwelling in the river. There were abominations waiting on the shore, and as if their eerie malice was not enough, there were worse things hiding in the darkness. Most of the creatures Sunny and Nephis met were of the great rank. However, these were not at all like the ferocious predators of Godgrave. The loathsome spawns of Godgrave were relatively young as far as beings of that rank went. They had all been born after the old world ended, created by the Crimson Jungle, tempered by its incessant hunger, made into fierce killing machines. The great nightmare creatures of Godgrave were fearsome, but they were not sophisticated. The abominations that dwelled in the underworld, however, were ancient. They had withstood the endless tides of elemental darkness and made their lairs in its cold embrace. The powers they wielded were as insidious as they were terrifying, and as a result, every day was like a nightmare for Sunny and Nephis. Some days were torn apart by dreadful battles. Some days were quiet and calm. But since danger could descend upon them at any moment, these times of placid silence only served to exhaust them further. The 2 of them had thought themselves as strong as the strongest beings of their rank, but the underworld had swiftly humbled them. Sunny knew that he would not have survived this journey without Nephis, and while Nephis was strong, she would not have survived the terrors of the underworld alone either. Together, though, connected by the shadow bond, they could just barely move forward. Chapter 3076, Ancient horrors. Nephis could survive almost any wound, and as long as she was alive, Sunny was not going to die either. No matter what kind of terrifying injury he received, she could heal it in a matter of minutes. Even for wounds dealt by especially terrifying foes, a few days was enough to completely erase them. That did not only mean that they were difficult to kill in a battle, that also meant that their wounds did not accumulate, weakening them more and more as the expedition stretched. Their longevity as combatants was unmatched. However, here in the underworld, the advantage of Neph's miraculous flames was not as great as it seemed. That was because death was not the worst thing facing them, by far. The stronger an enemy was, the more insidious their powers were. Abominations this powerful, this ancient, there was no end to ways in which they could threaten Sunny and Nephis apart from mundane physical attacks. Soul attacks, mental attacks, even attacks that targeted the enemy's spirit, as well as eerie methods of hunting prey that defied description. The horrors of the underworld could lull you into endless sleep, twist your desires and emotions, poison your mind with ghastly illusions, turn your own powers against you, and so much more. Each battle was a dangerous ordeal. If not for the fact that both Sunny and Nephis had already faced countless horrors, their minds would not have been able to cope with the sheer terror of what they were forced to endure in the darkness, shattering and turning them into raving lunatics. In fact, a person of a lower rank would have been driven mad simply by beholding the harrowing beings that dwelled in the underworld. That was where Sunny's exceptional adaptability and Neph's mastery of shaping shone. Their powers were not only formidable, but they were also extremely versatile, and with Cassie's help, they wielded the most dangerous weapon of them all. They wielded knowledge. Simply by knowing what their enemies were, they were already a step ahead of them. So it took the powers of 3 Supremes to stay alive in the underworld. As days passed, Sunny was more and more impressed by the fact that Broken Sword and his cohort had survived here as mere saints. It wasn't entirely clear how they had entered the underworld, by venturing into the Hollow Mountains, or simply using a nightmare gate to follow the call, but even if it was the latter, they would have still needed to travel some distance to locate the seed. And then there was the way back as well. Their incredible feat made Sunny feel hopeful. After all, if the original sovereigns had survived the underworld, then didn't it mean that he and Nephis could survive it too? So, they continued forward, undaunted. It took them about a week to reach one of the 3 great rivers of the underworld. There, the waters ran much deeper, so Sunny could not march at the center of the current anymore, staying away from the shores. Even close to the shore, the water was up to his chest. Standing on his shoulder, Nephis could see the foam seething down below. Saint was still moving ahead, skating across the flowing water at dire speed to keep up with Sunny's titanic form. Darkness billowed around her like a vast mantle. The enemies facing them only became more terrifying after they reached the great river. However, their speed did not diminish by much. That was because Sunny and Nephis were able to maintain their strength instead of being weakened further and further as days passed. They were actually growing stronger. It was partly because they were adapting to the underworld and swiftly learning how to traverse it better. But it was also because Sunny was continuously collecting new shades. There were 2 types of shades he could summon now. The first type was the great abominations he or Saint had slain. All of them possessed some way to resist elemental darkness, so they were not immediately destroyed when the creatures of darkness attacked, unlike his older shades, who had proven to be extremely vulnerable here in the underworld. The Dark Ones did not only vanquish shades, either they completely devoured them, destroying the shades forever. So Sunny hesitated to call upon the veterans of the Shadow Legion. The shades of the great nightmare creatures he had gained in the underworld were more resilient, but did not last long either. They served as a temporary shield between the small expedition force and the Dark Ones. The second type of shades he could summon in the underworld, however, was far more tenacious. They were the shadows of fallen stone saints. The 7 supreme shades from the crumbling settlement were still following Saint. More than that, more of her kin had gathered under her banner over time. There had not been a lot of stone saints in the ancient past. The first generation of them had been created by Nether, and later, as their number grew, their civilization seemed to spread along the great subterranean rivers that flowed through the underworld. The mountains Sunny and Nephis used to descend into the darkness had sheltered one of the entrances to their dark kingdom, so even if there were no other settlements along the length of the tributary they followed, there were small way stations, each of them built in the intricately beautiful style of the stone saints, but also fortified to serve as a fortress. And there were still children of Nether using these way stations to guard against the horrors that dwelled in the darkness, even if they themselves had succumbed to corruption and become those horrors as well. These abominations were weaker than the 7 great ones that had guarded the settlements, merely of the corrupted rank, but their number was greater. Being weaker did not mean that they were weak either. The fact that they had survived in the darkness of the underworld, despite being a whole rank below the weakest of the nightmare creatures Sunny and Nephis met in this lightless realm, was a testament to their formidable strength. The fallen children of Nether had survived the endless tides of darkness, but they did not survive Sunny, Nephis, and Saint. The 4 of them swept across the ancient way stations, conquering them one by one. Saint led the charge, augmented by both incarnations of Sunny, the 7 tainted saints, and Nephis followed, leaving the stalwart abominations no chance to survive. Like that, Saint's army slowly grew. By the time they reached the great river, she already commanded close to 100 shades of fallen stone saints, and that number only continued to increase. Chapter 360, 7/7 History of the Underworld. As days passed, filled by cold darkness and grueling battles, Sunny had not only been slaying terrifying abominations and enduring the pain of his titanic form being torn to shreds, he was also slowly learning more about the underworld, and especially about its history. The spell was stingy with granting him memories, let alone echoes, so he had not received any information from their descriptions. He had, however, gained quite a bit from the description of the shades he was gaining. Mostly, Sunny learned from exploring the crumbling way stations they were conquering. One could learn a lot from careful observation. Even if thousands of years had passed, destroying most traces, there were still signs left of what had transpired here. For example, it was clear that the way stations had been meant to house far larger garrisons, but were left with only skeleton crews to guard them. The size of sleeping quarters and the armories did not fit the number of the corrupted stone saints they had to fight, even accounting for thousands of years of attrition. There were also intact writings left in some of the way stations, shining a light on the distant past. Sunny knew that the underworld used to be the realm of Nether, the demon of choice, and that Nether had played a central role in the demonic rebellion. However, what he did not know was just how important the underworld had been for the uprising. The Hollow Mountains, and therefore the underworld, had been unique among all the realms. That was because they were connected to countless mortal realms, bridging the gap between them. Of course, very few were capable of crossing that bridge alive, unless the Prince of the Underworld welcomed them. The underworld had been the central stronghold of the Demon Legion. It was not only nearly impregnable, but also allowed the 6 rebellious demons to swiftly deploy their troops to various mortal realms and move between them, attacking and retreating unpredictably, as well as recruit more warriors to the banner of rebellion. That was why the Demon Legion had been able to contend against the Divine Host in the early years of the war, despite being a much smaller and weaker force. But, as Sunny already knew, the Doom War had not been kind to the demons. Despite their initial success, its tides eventually turned against them. As existence itself was coming undone in the annihilating flames of the bitter war between the gods and the daemon, the Demon Legion suffered defeat after defeat and was pushed back on all fronts. That was why Nether and his siblings had made a choice to resort to one last, desperate measure, to open the Void Gate and unleash the Forgotten God upon the world. In the last days of the war, the underworld had become the last stronghold of the Demon Legion. The victorious Divine Host laid siege to it, but the daemons were preparing to launch a different, far more daring assault. Descending to the darkest depths of the underworld, Nether led their warriors into the abyss and invaded the Shadow Realm, challenging death and its endless legions, the shadows of everyone who had perished in the cataclysm of the Doom War. Sunny had seen the last minutes of that mythical battle himself. That was where Orphney of the Nine had killed Weaver for the 2nd time, and where the nightmare spell was born. So that was the reason why the entrance to the underworld was littered with ancient corpses, and why the way stations and settlements of the Stone Saints seemed so empty. Most of the Stone Saints had followed Nether to lay siege to the realm of death. The 7 great ones who were slain in the crumbling settlements, and the fallen Stone Saints Sunny and Nephis encountered as they traversed the tributary river, had been the rear guard of the Demon Legion, those tasked with holding back the divine host for as long as possible, while the last battle of the Doom War unfolded far below. In the end, the Void Gate had been open, and even though the forgotten god was lulled to sleep by the nightmare spell, corruption still swallowed all of existence. Eventually, the remaining Stone Saints fell to it as well. Thousands of years later, the realm of elemental darkness was ruled by monsters and abominations. The throne of the underworld was empty, and the Stone Saints who had held the beings of the dark abyss back before were too few to prevent them from conquering its vast expanse. Even those who remained had become nightmare creatures, their nature twisted by corruption. That was the realm Sunny and Nephis had to traverse in search of the last fragment of Weaver's lineage. Traveling along the tributary river had already been perilous enough. When they reached one of the 3 great rivers of the underworld, however, things swiftly went from bad to worse. There was another settlement of the Stone Saints at the point where the tributary flowed into the main body of the river. That one was no more than a ruin, though, the children of Nether who had guarded it once gone. Instead, a cursed abomination made its nest amidst the rubble. Unwilling to disturb it, they sneaked past the ruins in utter darkness. That was the first cursed nightmare creature Sunny and Nephis had encountered in the underworld, but these were merely its outskirts. Things were bound to get worse as they moved further north, approaching the capital of the fallen Stone Saint civilization. They could challenge this cursed one to a battle, and they stood a good chance of defeating it. However, there was no telling what kind of horrors the echoes of the ferocious battle would attract, and what beings would emerge from the darkness once the fallen deity who had claimed the ruins was gone. Sunny felt like he was on the bottom of the food chain once again. Soon, it became painfully apparent that they could not continue traveling in the same manner anymore. Chapter 3078. A New Approach. Sunny looked up, the radiance spilling from beneath his visor and illuminating the boundless darkness above. There, a vast expanse of tattered cloth seemed to be descending upon them, billowing in the wind. Of course, it was not really a giant swath of fabric. It was a creature of darkness he was familiar with, a dark drifter, like the ones who had tried to devour the shadow of condemnation in the realm of death. Sunny did not know what would happen if the nebulous body of the dark drifter enveloped them, and he did not want to find out. Being spiritually digested by an eerie nightmare creature was not on his bucket list. The peculiar flesh of the creature of darkness seemed to ripple and seethe when exposed to the light shining from within Sunny's helmet, but it was not destroyed by it. A moment later, however, a ray of blinding light that spanned hundreds of meters in length sliced through the dark drifter, drowning in the boundless darkness of its billowing body. That was Nephis channeling her flames through the blessing. For a moment it seemed that the light was swallowed by the darkness. But then a thin cut appeared on the surface of the dark drifter, its body sliced apart. Standing on Sunny's shoulder, Nephis prepared to deliver a second blow. Sunny, however, was a little preoccupied at the moment, so he could not pay attention to her every move. While the dark drifter was threatening them from above, below, the black waters of the great subterranean river boiled and foamed. Enormous tentacles rose from the dark depths, wrapping themselves around Sunny's arm and neck. There was a powerful nightmare creature attacking his titanic form from below. Wow, look at me. The scene reminded him of traveling across the forgotten shore atop the statue of the builder. Back then, the walking colossus seemed too enormous to be real, like a mysterious deity. Now Sunny was about the same size, and dealing with problems of the same magnitude as well. The shades of the tainted saints who used his shoulders as battlements unleashed a hail of ranged attacks at the sprawling tentacles of the depth dweller. Sunny, meanwhile, raised his other hand and tore into the spongy flesh with the claws of his armored gauntlet, trying to prevent the creature from shattering his neck. The vambrace of his trapped arm was bending, a net of cracks snaking through its surface. Beneath it, Sunny's forearm wasn't doing much better. The creature wasn't powerful enough to crush his bones, but it was close. At the same time, It was expelling a river of corrosive venom that eroded his armor, seeped through its cracks, and burned through his stone-like flesh. The agony was exquisite. "Saint, hurry up, please." Saint was nowhere to be seen. That was because just seconds earlier, she had increased her weight to its original crushing immensity and plunged into the water like a stone. Now she was at the bottom of the river, searching for the source of the gargantuan tentacles to destroy it. Sunny felt like his neck was about to snap by the time a powerful convulsion spread through the tentacles, and the spell whispered into his ear. "You have slain a great demon, horror of the lightless current. Your shadow grows stronger." His arm was a mangled mess by then. Almost at the same time, Neff finally managed to destroy the Dark Drifter, which had been only seconds away from enveloping Sunny like a colossal black shroud. Sunny let out a relieved sigh. The pain finally caught up with him then, making him grunt and stagger a little. Standing on his enormous shoulder, Nephis turned and glanced at a hill-sized helmet looming above her in the darkness. Although she could not see, its opposite side was corroded by acid and falling apart. "Are you all right?" Sunny turned his head to look at her. He could answer, but his voice was not exactly subtle in this form. It would spread far and wide, announcing their presence to all the horrors that dwelled in a vast area around them. So he simply shook his head. This time he had sustained a lot of damage. A moment later, Saint surfaced in the distance. She looked battered and in dire need of reprieve as well. Slaying the Depth's dweller must have released a lot of acid into the current, and since she was the one who had killed it, the acid damaged her armor extensively. It was as if Saint had taken a bath in a vat of it. Sunny hesitated for a moment, then turned to study the shore. At that moment, they were not too far from it. The water only reached up to his chest, while the center of the river was much, much deeper. He studied the shore, illuminating its desolate landscape, and then pointed in the direction of a distant ruin. There did not seem to be any more abominations lurking near the water, so Sunny wanted to rest and recover from the consequences of the battle. After Nephis nodded, he headed toward the shore. Saint was already catching up, gliding across the surface of the river at dire speed. As she approached, the shades of the fallen saints seemed to become more lively. If that word could be applied to the lifeless shadows of the dead, turning their heads in her direction. Soon Sunny climbed onto the dark stones and finally released the form of the Jade Titan, becoming human once again. The shades spread across the nameless ruin, guarding its perimeter. He meanwhile dismissed the jade mantle and sat down on a large boulder with a tired sigh. Nephis approached to take a look at his mangled arm. The damage looked ghastly, some of the deeper wounds revealing glimpses of bone, but it wasn't bad enough for her to use her aspect. Sunny possessed exceptional vitality after all. Given his rank, his arm was going to heal on its own in no time. Nevertheless, that was the third time he had been wounded since they reached the great river, which happened only a couple of days ago. Ignoring the pain, Sunny sighed somberly and glanced at Nephis. "We cannot continue this way, I think. It's time to change our approach." Chapter 3079. Backup Plan. The underworld was not a place that Supremes could tread lightly. This realm of eternal darkness had been the last stronghold of the Demon Legion and the staging ground of the last battle of the Doom War. Somewhere out there, the corrupted remnants of the divine host were hidden in the darkness, and the fallen warriors of the 6 rebellious daemons guarded their ruined fortresses. There were beings of true darkness ruling the vast desolation of the subterranean world as well. There were ancient nightmare creatures of immense power and dark deities of the dream realm populating this land. Sunny and Nephis had expected their expedition to be a perilous one, but they had underestimated just how terrifying and deadly the darkness of the underworld would be. Even Sunny, who had only brought 2 of his 7 incarnations here, was not safe because there were plenty of enemies here who directly assaulted his soul, spirit, and mind. At this point, they could still choose to turn back. However, neither Sunny nor Nephis were inclined to give up. The underworld was deadly. Yes, perhaps even more than they could handle. But then again, so was every other dire threat they would have to face soon. Giving up in the face of danger was a path that would inevitably lead them to a dead end, and if they failed to achieve their goals now, before facing the ultimate horrors of the dream realm, they would have no hope in the future. That said, they didn't have to stubbornly continue forward with the same plan. Now that their initial expectations had been proven to be wrong, they had to adapt. Sunny and Nephis had planned to slowly explore the underworld, casting a wide net to find traces of Broken Sword. The underworld was impossibly vast, and searching for the final resting place of a single man seemed like searching for a needle in a haystack. However, there were ways to narrow down the areas they had to scour. What Sunny and Nephis truly aimed for was finding the place where the sovereigns had betrayed Broken Sword. After all, finding one man in the endless darkness was all but impossible, but finding a battlefield where 4 supremes had fought was not too difficult. Such a fierce battle had to have left many traces, perhaps even reshaping the very landscape around it. Mordred and the Dream Spawn had managed to forever change the face of the Dream Realm while battling each other. So Sunny and Nephis reasonably presumed that a battle between Broken Sword, Anvil, Key Song, and the Dream Spawn would have left Asgard on the underworld as well. And yet, in only the second week of their journey through the underworld, they realized that their previous plans had been too optimistic. Exploring slowly and casting a wide net was not something they could reliably survive with their current strength. They had managed to stay alive so far, but assuming that their luck would hold was an arrogant notion. It was easy to become arrogant after surviving everything they had survived. More than that, arrogance was in the very nature of being supreme. But Sunny was not so detached from reality as to believe that he was immortal, and that there was no being out there that could still squish him like a bug. Luckily, they had not come to the underworld unprepared. They had a backup plan as well, even if it posed its own risks. When Sunny suggested exploring a different approach, Nephis remained silent for a short while, then looked around. The ruins surrounding them did not offer much protection, but it was better than nothing. The dark figures of the tainted saints could be seen among the rubble, facing the impenetrable darkness beyond. They were dutifully guarding Sunny and Nephis, ready to defend them with their lives. Saint had left the circle of light emanating from the blade of the blessing. Her powers grew more potent when she was surrounded by darkness, and especially true darkness, so she chose to stay away, for now, so that her body and armor could mend themselves faster. There was a faint frown on Neph's face. "Do you feel it?" Sunny hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He knew what she was talking about. The Dark Drifter had been destroyed, and the horrid dweller of the depths had been slain. There were no enemies around them anymore, and yet Sunny could still feel someone's subtle attention being directed at them. Something was observing them from the darkness, almost imperceptible, but refused to show up. That feeling had pursued them ever since the first day in the underworld. The first enemy they had fought here, the mysterious creature of darkness, who had used the corpses of slain stone saints to attack them, was yet to reveal itself again, but Sunny felt that somehow it was still watching them, waiting. For what, he did not know, but the patience of the unknown being unnerved him quite a bit. Sunny shrugged. "I do, and since there's nothing we can do about it, let's just proceed." They had attempted to confront the eerie gaze on many occasions, searching for its source or even trying to provoke it into attacking by feigning weakness and inattention. But the unknown creature remained hidden in the darkness, never revealing itself. It was as if darkness itself was watching them. Suppressing a shiver, Sunny took a deep breath and summoned one of the 2 divine memories he possessed. Moments later, Weaver's mask obscured his face, the cool surface of its polished wood soothing him and hiding his features. In truth, Sunny could locate the last fragment of Weaver's lineage quite easily. All he had to do was activate the "Where is my eye" enchantment of Weaver's mask and gaze upon the harrowing infinity of fate. His fate was connected to Weaver, and therefore there had to be a string of fate connecting him to Shadow Weave. Sunny could find that string and follow it to the source. That way, he would know the direction they had to follow at least. However, while that method was simple, it was not at all safe. In fact, it could very well prove more dangerous than blindly searching the dark expanse of the underworld. Chapter 3080, Learning from Examples. It used to be that merely activating "Where is my eye" was lethally dangerous to Sunny. His mortal mind was not meant to behold the endlessness of fate, so gazing upon it could utterly obliterate him. In fact, Sunny had come very close to being annihilated the first time he saw it, closer than ever before or after, perhaps. Gradually, however, the situation changed. Now that Sunny was supreme, a true demigod, his consciousness was vast and potent enough to survive glimpsing fate. Of course, he was still not qualified to perceive fate in all its infinite glory, but he could endure the burden of being exposed to it long enough to limit the scope of his perception, at least. He could even touch the strings of fate, absorbing endless mysteries contained within them, witnessing events that had taken place in the ancient past, learning tantalizing secrets of the present, even glimpsing hints of the future that had been meant to come, but never arrived. Sunny had been quite excited by that ability of his once, hoping that he could gain a treasure trove of knowledge by interacting with the strings of fate. However, knowledge was a sword that cut both ways. Sunny had not failed to learn from the examples of Cassie and Mordred. Cassie had learned something that she was not meant to know, and had to destroy herself as a result. If not for the miraculous power of her aspect, she would have been dead by now, or worse still, consumed by corruption. Mordred had glimpsed the terrifying truth of the dream realm as he ascended the pinnacle of apotheosis and was cast down into the boundless darkness of corruption moments later. Unlike Cassie, he did not survive the sharp edge of knowledge. Sunny was in a similar position to them. He was powerful enough to brush against the forbidden truths of existence, but not powerful enough to survive them, and since there was no telling what he would see in the endless tapestry of fate, using his ability to gaze into the strings of fate was innately hazardous. Still, as long as he was careful, it was less dangerous than blindly wandering the underworld. Granted, using "Where is my eye?" posed another danger. Despite how inexhaustible Sunny's reserve of essence seemed, the task of sustaining the active enchantment of Weaver's mask still put a strain on it. Even if he determined the direction they had to follow, he would be left weakened for a while. Weakened in the depths of the underworld, no less. But with Nephis and Saint there to pick up the slack, Sunny could take that risk. He exhaled slowly. Nephis studied him for a moment before asking, "Are you ready?" Sunny remained motionless for a moment, then shook his head and activated. "Where is my eye?" The great tapestry of fate revealed itself to him. Suddenly, the endless darkness of the underworld did not seem so endless anymore. In fact, it was utterly dwarfed by the infinite expanse of torn, tangled strings that permeated it like a spider's web. It seemed like an ant facing a vast, glittering galaxy. He felt a terrible pressure descend on his mind, pushing it to the verge of shattering. Gasping, he swiftly blinded himself to the immensity of fate, concentrating only on a small part of the great tapestry on himself. Around Sunny, the mass of strings of fate was so thick that it almost looked like a solid wall. Countless threads pierced his body, wound tightly around him, as if he was a puppet controlled by 1,000 puppeteers. Sunny did not know how he had managed to move under the weight of all these strings before, how he had been able to breathe before. But now that the strings of fate were torn and untethered, they gave a little, allowing him a measure of freedom. One of these threads connected him to Shadow Weave. Now, he just had to find it. Finding a single thread among the myriad strings of fate entangling Sunny was difficult, but not impossible. After all, each of them was different, and those touched by divinity were special. Sunny did not know how to describe the feeling, but it was as if all strings of fate had a unique presence that he could just barely sense. Still, there were more than a few of them that Sunny felt drawn to. The pull they exerted was his intuition giving him a hint. He hesitated for a few moments, then raised a hand and reached toward one of the strings. His fingers touched the intangible thread, and in the next moment a torrent of images flooded his mind. A torrent of dreadful, appalling images that carried with them a horrible truth. In the visions, Sunny was struggling and screaming as he was being buried alive. His struggles were hopeless, because strong ropes bound his body, and his screams were muffled because a bone mask covered his face. A mask with 3 eyes carved from the skull of a being that had come from the void. At first, the soil was like a blanket that covered him. Then it obscured the sky. Then it grew into a crushing weight that pressed down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Eventually, a towering barrow grew above Sunny, heavy enough to crush stones into dust. But Sunny wasn't crushed. He didn't die. He couldn't die. Because he was. Gritting his teeth, Sunny pulled his hand away from the string of fate. It wasn't easy. In fact, it had felt as if his fingers fused with the ethereal thread, its pull so overpowering that even his supreme strength was not enough to let go. Now that he looked at it, the string of fate was suddenly inky black, an appalling darkness covered it like oil, seeping out from the torn thread. Looking down, Sunny saw the same appalling darkness marring his fingers, slowly being absorbed into his skin. The tips of his fingers were already beginning to rot. Feeling a cold shiver run down his spine, he concentrated and resisted the vestige of corruption that was trying to take root in his body and soul. Nephis. Moments later, a cleansing flame enveloped his hand. Since Sunny had barely glimpsed the soul of the man being buried alive, he was only subjected to an insignificant amount of corruption. So, his innate resistance and Neph's flames managed to eradicate it before it poisoned his soul. Trembling, he studied his hand for a long while, making sure that no trace of the appalling rot remained. Then, he took a deep breath and reached for the next string. An eternity later, Sunny sighed and dismissed Weaver's mask. His face was even paler than usual, the skin around his eyes charred and seeping with blood. He looked north. Sunny remained motionless for a short while and then closed his eyes. This time, he had managed to escape. Where is my eye without losing his own? He also had not needed Nephis to bring him out of the trance. However, the strain had still been tremendous, but the result was worth it. Exhaling slowly, Sunny opened his eyes and looked at Nephis. We will have to reach the very heart of the underworld. Chapter 3081, Skulking Like Rats. There were many settlements in the underworld, but only one city, the city where Nether, the demon of destiny, had reigned. Sunny saw its magnificent spires when he touched the string of fate that connected him to Shadow Weave. He also saw glimpses of the ruthless battle between the four Supremes, the battle where Broken Sword, Neph's father, had been fatally wounded by his former companions. Broken Sword fled into the darkness of the underworld. None of the sovereigns had seen him die, so Sunny was tempted to harbor a far-fetched, improbable hope, a hope that somewhere out there Broken Sword was still alive. But he couldn't be. The spell itself announced his death, and judging by what Sunny saw when he touched the string of fate, the wounds dealt to Broken Sword had indeed been fatal. His soul, body, and mind, all of it had been shattered, and yet Broken Sword still seemed to have reached the fallen city of the Demon of Destiny somehow, which meant that now Sunny and Nephis had to reach it as well. However, they couldn't proceed in the same way they had been advancing before. Up until now, Sunny and Nephis had been moving openly, relying on their strength to push back and repel the many perils of the underworld. Now they had to do the opposite. If their strength was not enough, they had to remember the old days of being weak and defenseless. They had to hide from the powerful abominations instead of slaying them and rely on stealth instead of strength. Even if those times had long passed, Sunny still vividly remembered being on the bottom of the food chain. The forgotten shore, the chained isles, even Antarctica. He had survived long enough to become supreme by being cautious and listening to his fear. We need to sneak into the heart of the underworld like little rats. The problem was that even moving stealthily wasn't easy in the underworld. Usually Sunny would have hidden in the shadows, but there were no shadows here, only the endless darkness. Nephis could shine her light into the darkness, chasing it away and creating a place for shadows to appear, but being the only source of light in this lightless realm was like painting a target on herself. So Sunny's gaze turned to Saint. He considered something for a long while, then sighed. Let's try it this way. After resting for a short while in the ruins, they prepared to continue heading north. However, this time, the manner in which they advanced would have to be entirely different. That was because this time neither Sunny nor Nephis would be lighting the way. Nephis had completely abandoned the notion of using her aspect to push the darkness back. At the moment, she was only calling on her powers to heal the subjects of her domain on countless battlefields of the dream realm and the waking world, with none of her light shining in the underworld. With Neph's light gone, Sunny was once again rendered powerless. He did not reshape himself into the Jade Titan, though, choosing to remain human. He was better off than Nephis, at least. Even if his powers were entirely suppressed, he could still see what was happening in the darkness and feel its currents through Saint Nephis, meanwhile, had become entirely blind. For someone who was used to being vigilant and staying alert, always observing their surroundings to be aware of any potential threat. That was a profoundly uncomfortable state. Nephis pursed her lips, exhaled slowly, and then steeled herself. Sunny approached her and quietly took her hand. At the same time, he dismissed the shades of the stone saints, allowing them to return into the lightless abyss of his soul. He guided Nephis to where Saint stood on the shore of the river, carefully choosing a path to prevent her from stumbling. Once they were near Saint, he asked, "Are you ready?" Nephis lingered for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't think that matters." With that, she turned into a torrent of flame and fused with Sunny's human form, seeping under his skin and filling him with an indescribable feeling of power. A moment later, Sunny inhaled deeply and turned into a shadow, wrapping himself around Saint, now left alone on the shore. Saint closed her jewel-like eyes, hiding the brilliant white radiance that shone from their depths. She allowed the true darkness to wash over her, perceiving its currents with her mystical senses. And then Saint turned into a torrent of darkness herself. The torrent rushed north, following the path of the river. That was how they continued the perilous journey through the underworld. Without any light, the horrors that dwelled in its dark expanse were not lured to the daring invaders. Saint did not disturb the abominations either. Every time one of them sensed a hostile presence, she hid or circled around the dangerous area. Considering her affinity to elemental darkness, she could conceal herself quite thoroughly, and with Cassie watching over them from far away, they were alerted when an enemy was nearby, far in advance. In most cases, of course, no method of stealth was perfect, especially here in the underworld. There were many abominations who possessed extraordinary senses. When encountering those, Saint did her best to flee. If even her speed was not enough, though, she assumed her material form and engaged in battle. Saint had always been strong and exceptionally skilled, and now that she was surrounded by the boundless expanse of elemental darkness, her power had reached its peak, and of course she was augmented by the potent fusion of Sunny's shadows and Neph's flame, so her lethality had become truly chilling. In fact, she seemed to be growing stronger as days passed. Channeling both true darkness and nothingness, Saint meticulously weakened and killed many terrifying nightmare creatures. If she faced an abomination who was too powerful and insidious, she wounded them instead, targeting their joints and limbs with ruthless precision. Once the abominations were slowed down, she retreated and escaped instead of pressing the fight. In that manner, they traveled deeper and deeper into the underworld. Chapter 3082. Prodigal Saint Returns. After several days of journeying through the underworld, using Saint as their lethal envoy, things seemed to settle into a steady rhythm. Saint traversed the harrowing expanse of elemental darkness, hiding from powerful enemies and engaging in ferocious battles when escape was not an option. Even if her armor was damaged or her stone-like body was wounded, the damage was swiftly mended by her abilities. At the moment, it seemed like that stealthy approach was working quite well. There were 3 exceptions, though. The first exception was the cursed nightmare creatures that dwelled in the darkest corners of the underworld. These were too perilous for Saint to fight and possessed extremely keen perception, so even trying to hide from them was a gamble. Luckily, the fallen deities of the dream realm were usually hard to miss. The very world and a vast area around them was heavily influenced by their presence, so Sunny and Nephis, and especially Cassie, could usually sense them from afar. If nothing else, they could feel the tyrannical force of an alien will suffusing the very fabric of the world ahead of them, which alerted them to danger. Instead of trying to traverse the territory of the cursed ones, Saint had to take a circle around them, no matter how much time that added to the journey. Sometimes, the detour resulted in dangerous clashes with other horrors inhabiting the underworld, but that was a price they had to pay. The second exception was the creatures of darkness. While Saint's affinity to elemental darkness allowed her to hide herself from most nightmare creatures of the underworld, it had no effect on the Dark Ones. In fact, they could sense her movements with perfect clarity. Some chose to attack, while some did not. These creatures did not harbor an innate compulsion to destroy all that was not corrupted after all. However, they seemed to dislike light and had an appetite for shadows. So those who could sense Sunny and Nephis hidden in the depths of Saint's darkness would inevitably turn hostile. Those who could not, though, would usually let her pass with cold indifference. The clashes with the Dark Ones were the most hazardous and fearsome among all the battles Saint had to fight, since they could challenge her authority over elemental darkness. None had managed to render her sword and armor as ineffective as the first creature of darkness they had encountered, but fighting them was still a chillingly dangerous affair. Luckily, creatures of darkness were more susceptible to the power of nothingness than nightmare creatures, and since Saint could wield both elements as weapons, she had managed to emerge from these fierce battles victorious. For now, her authority over darkness seemed to have grown stronger as a result. The third exception was the fallen stone saints. Every time Saint encountered a ruined outpost or a settlement of her kin, she halted her advance and attacked, as if unwilling to abandon them in the indignity of their shameful existence. The stone saints were prideful beings. Saint was, at least. Although her emotions were muted and difficult to interpret, it felt like she would rather be killed than succumb to corruption. No one had been there to end her profane existence when Saint herself had become an abomination. So she was determined to give her kind the mercy she herself had been denied. Saint was alone, while the fallen stone saints were many, and yet she eliminated them all, invading their strongholds like a tide of darkness and slaughtering them in fierce melee. Her sword never wavered, and her shield never fell. In the end, the ruins grew quiet once more. There were more settlements on the shores of the great river, and the way stations here were far larger, resembling actual fortresses. Cleansing them took a considerable amount of time, and Saint often received grievous wounds during the battles, especially if her fallen kin were commanded by a champion of the great rank. But Sunny never tried to dissuade her from taking action. For one, he wanted to respect Saint's wishes. She rarely expressed any kind of desire, so if she wanted to see this through, Sunny felt like he owed it to her to lend his support. He was definitely not going to force her to do otherwise. Also, the more of the fallen stone saints she killed, the more shades joined the Shadow Legion. So really, Sunny had nothing to complain about. After a stronghold was cleared, Saint stopped to rest and mend her wounds. These were the only times Sunny and Nephis regained their human forms, using the short moment of respite to recover from the burdens of the perilous journey. They chatted, enjoyed some food, anything that could be prepared without a fire, and took turns sleeping. Nephis was still unable to see anything, so Sunny had to guide her carefully, as if she were a blind person. That, too, reminded him of the forgotten shore. Those times felt so far away now. Just like that, days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The situation in the outside world was slowly growing worse. There was no news of Effie, Kai, Jet, and the other three who had entered the fourth nightmare. Ananke and Cassie did their best to prevent the world from falling apart, while Mordred helped from time to time. But even with their efforts, humanity was suffering grievous losses. A few more citadels fell. Most were evacuated in advance, but not all of them. In the waking world, 2 populous cities completely collapsed under the tide of Nightmare Gates, causing a mass evacuation. If not for the firekeepers who had arrived just in time, the loss of life would have been appalling. But even with their help, the refugees had to be relocated into neighboring cities, which were already suffering from their own structural problems. With millions of people pouring into these cities, the strain had only grown more dire. In that heavy atmosphere, Saint made her way through the boundless darkness of the underworld. And after 2 months of that hazardous journey, she finally reached its heart. Chapter 3083, Heart of the Underworld. A graceful stone knight stood on a tall cliff, gazing at the magnificent city in the distance. She was surrounded by an endless expanse of flowing darkness, and so was the city. However, it shimmered with myriad silver lights, resembling a piece of a starlit sky lost in the boundless depths of the cosmos. The silence was broken only by the murmur of rushing water. Below the cliff, one of the 3 great rivers of the underworld was flowing under a veil of ghostly mist, its surface glistening like polished black glass. Its current was faster here, in the heart of the underworld. That was because somewhere out there, far ahead, the river plummeted into an abyssal chasm. The city that the demon of destiny had built stood at the edge of the abyss, facing its dark, bottomless vastness. Beholding the distant city through Saint's eyes, Sunny could not help but feel a sense of awe. It was a strange and breathtaking sight, cut from indomitable stone but graceful and soaring. The city had no name. Nether had never bothered to give it one, and if the stone saints had, it was long gone, lost from the pages of history. However, the city still stood, serving as a testament to their brief existence. It was worthy of being called a marvel of the dream realm, even if few humans had ever witnessed its exquisite beauty. The city was located in the center of a colossal cavern. Enormous stalagmites rose from the cavern's floor, and similarly great stalactites, each the size of a mountain, hung from its distant ceiling. The city was not built from stone, but rather carved from it. The black fangs of the cavern had been carved like ivory tusks, revealing graceful shapes of magnificent buildings, serpentine roads, and exquisite monuments. Because of that, the city was largely vertical. The stalagmites and stalactites that composed it were connected by arching aerial bridges and aqueducts, creating a mesmerizing stone web. Below the city, flowing clouds of white mist hid the turbulent currents of the great river. Above the city, impenetrable darkness swallowed the distant ceiling of the colossal cavern. Suspended between nothingness and darkness, the city shimmered with radiant lights. Those were myriad lanterns that contained divine flame, which still burned despite thousands of years that had passed since the gods perished. It was the only source of light Sunny and Nephis had found in the underworld, and after months spent in total darkness, the sight of it felt like a beautiful mirage. And that was only what a human eye could see. Sunny, however, could see much more. That mad bastard. He was stunned, because in his eyes Nether's city looked like one enormous machine, or a vast sorcerous array, perhaps. The energy needed to sustain the city and operate its many bridges and soaring elevators was drawn from the current of the great river below. There were enormous water wheels hidden from view by the billowing mist, setting an infinitely complex system of spinning gears in motion. The clockwork gears produced a very mundane kinetic energy, but that was not the only energy suffusing the desolate city. Sunny could also see torrents of soul essence flowing through special channels that were carved into the stone. He did not know where the essence was coming from, but it was responsible for powering myriad runic enchantments throughout the city, and that was not all either. What truly stunned Sunny was something that he had noticed through Saint's eyes. It was the third element of the intricate system that sustained Nether's city, the element that harnessed true darkness itself, guiding its currents into stone channels and drawing some sort of power from it. Nether had used one of the great rivers of the underworld, soul essence and true darkness, to breathe life into his city. And even now, thousands of years after the demon of destiny fell, his city was still alive, shining like a jewel in the boundless darkness of this vast and harrowing subterranean realm. Nether's citadel itself stood at the very edge of the city, directly above the great waterfall that plunged into the abyss, or rather, hovered above it. There, the largest stalagmite of the colossal cavern rose to meet the greatest stalactite. The palace of the demon of destiny levitated in the empty space between them, functioning as the beating heart of all the sorceries sustaining the city, surrounded by slowly revolving rings cast from metal and cut from black stone. The Jade Palace was ornate and opulent, built to be a magnificent home for a beautiful queen. The Mirror Castle was austere and stalwart, true to its nature as a fortress. Nether's stronghold, however, seemed to have been built without a particular interest in style and aesthetics, serving a purely utilitarian purpose. In fact, it did not even look like a single structure. Rather, it looked like an ensemble of structures that had been haphazardly joined together, most likely built one by one throughout centuries. There were mysterious spires, towering crucibles, domes carved from flawlessly transparent crystal, and intricately adorned black edifices supported by tall pillars. Despite that, the complex looked graceful and imposing, one of its facades turned to the city, the other facing the boundless abyss below. Unseen to the eye, it was the confluence for torrents of both the soul essence and true darkness that powered the magnificent city as well. The beauty and splendor of that view was stunning. But Sunny only spent a few moments absorbed by the stunning sight. Then his attention shifted to something else. A sense of somber apprehension rose in his heart. That was because he had sensed something else hidden behind the dark beauty of Nether City, a vast ocean of alien will permeating the world around it. Something was waiting for them in the heart of the underworld. Something malevolent, powerful, titanic. It seemed like their terrifying expedition was about to crash into the worst obstacle yet. Chapter 3084. Weight of Absence. Since the city was illuminated by myriad divine flames, there was no purpose in hiding anymore. After a long time of clinging to Saint, Sunny, and Nephis finally assumed their human forms once again. It felt nice to feel the wind on his own face and solid ground under his own feet. Sunny spent a few moments enjoying the feeling of being a corporeal creature, then rotated his shoulders and stretched, letting out a satisfied groan. I guess we made it after all. During their harrowing journey, there had been a lot of moments when he thought that they wouldn't. Of course, they had not achieved their goal yet. Now, using his own eyes, Sunny looked at the distant city once more. The city was vast, and apart from the eerie adversary that waited for them there, the last fragment of Weaver's lineage was somewhere ahead as well. Finding it would not be too difficult, but to do that, they had to conquer the city first. Sunny's gaze turned to Nether's stronghold that hovered at the far end of the city. That magnificent palace, laboratory, workshop had his keen interest as well. The Jade Palace, the Mirror Castle, the Night Garden, the Ivory Tower, every stronghold left behind by the Daemons, with the exception of the Tomb of Ariel, had turned out to be a great citadel. Would this one be the same? If so, there was no telling what its components were, but they were certain to be immensely potent. The crushing could flatten entire regions of the Dream Realm, after all, while the Jade Palace could reshape entire realms, and was currently holding back the lethal cold of the frozen wastelands. Bastion contained an entire imaginary world, and was itself an imagined realm. Its true version, meanwhile, was hidden in reflections and could only be accessed by its master. The Night Garden could travel anywhere, and granted Nephis the ability to connect 2 points in the same realm with her Dream Gate. So, conquering the city could become an astonishing boon for the human domain. Even if the components of the great citadel at its heart proved to be of little use, ruling the citadel itself would greatly enhance the power of any supreme. Of course, they needed to conquer it first to find out. A deep frown appeared on Sunny's face. He could feel the stifling power of someone else's malevolent will covering the world ahead. That will was vast, ancient, and uncompromising. He hesitated for a moment, unsure how to evaluate it. Its tyrannical force felt more oppressive than the will of an ordinary great nightmare creature, but less absolute than the divine will of a cursed one. It felt like the will of a titan. That was already bad enough, since great titans were among the most unfathomable and terrifying foes Sunny had ever encountered. More so even than cursed abominations of lesser classes, however, there was something worse. Sunny was not sure how to describe it, but he felt that there was something else hiding behind the oppressive ocean of malevolent will, some other, far more subtle presence. That presence was almost imperceptible and hard to define, utterly alien and unknowable. And that made it far more threatening than any great titan could be. Sunny hesitated for a long while, then looked at Nephis. "What do you think?" She was observing the distant city as well. Nephis lingered, then answered in a reserved tone, "It's going to be a grueling battle." She sounded aloof, but Sunny sensed a hint of inner turmoil in her voice. He studied her silently before asking, "Are you nervous?" Nephis smiled faintly and looked at him. "Because of the battle? No, not really." Then she turned to the city once more. Her smile turned wistful. "My father's corpse is somewhere out there. If we win, when we win, we'll find him." She fell silent and then said quietly, "A part of me hopes against all hope that somehow he is still alive." Neff's smile disappeared, replaced by a distant expression. "But most of me hopes that he is dead." She looked at Sunny and smiled again. This time her faint smile was bitter. "Because death is the only excuse I can accept. I can't accept the thought that he is still alive, having abandoned me in that hell. Does that make me a terrible daughter?" Sunny shook his head slowly. "That just makes you human." Nephis sighed and turned to the distant light of the radiant city. "I barely remember him by now. I was only 4 when he disappeared, after all. The most prominent feature of my father, the one that shaped me the most, was his absence." and yet his crushing shadow has always loomed over me. That's a bit ironic, don't you think? The crushing weight of absence." Sunny remained silent for a few moments, then smiled. "Maybe. I guess it is, but what do I know? I didn't have a father either. Of course, my father wasn't the greatest hero of humanity. He was just a maintenance worker from the outskirts." He paused for a moment and then added quietly, "His absence was just as crushing, though. Still, I think we've done quite well for ourselves, despite everything. They'd both be proud. I'd be." After that, Sunny shook his head. "And hey, at least neither of us is Mordred, right? Now, that guy's father. When I think about that damn lunatic, I feel like I have no right to complain." Nephis suddenly laughed, then raised her hand to cover her mouth, mortified. She gave Sunny a rueful look. "Why are you making me laugh before an important battle? We have to go and slay that horror, whatever it is. It's no time to joke around, you know." Sunny looked at her with a smile. "Because I can?" Then he sighed and turned to the city. The three of them, Sunny, Nephis, and Saint, steeled themselves, preparing to storm the heart of the underworld. A few moments later, Sunny sighed, "Well, let's go and slay that horror, whatever it is." Chapter 3085, Above the Abyss. The shimmering city was cut from the gigantic pillars of stone, some rising from the white mist on the floor of the continent-sized cavern, some hanging from the impenetrable darkness that hid its ceiling. As such, it had no wall and no gate. The vast expanse of the great river, hidden under the billowing clouds of nothingness, served as its moat. Additionally, there were layered ramparts and battlements on the outer ring of stalagmites, high above the swirling mist. Even higher, the outer stalactites were encircled by defensive fortifications too. In case of an assault, the defenders of the city could unleash an endless hail of arrows and projectiles on the attacking adversary, and even if one of the great stalagmites was conquered, advancing further into the city would become a nightmarish trial for the audacious foe. Not only would the conquerors remain perfectly exposed to ranged attacks from above, but the vertical districts of the city were only connected by aerial bridges, which were easy to defend and difficult to attack. The magnificent city was a natural fortress, but that was only in case of an ordinary ground assault, naturally. Any besieging army would have to brave the rapid currents of the great river that rushed toward the titanic waterfall first, not to mention the tides of nothingness. Even then, Sunny had a suspicion that the Stone Saints had not been worried about ordinary enemies when building their city. The foes they had faced here in the underworld were beings of a different nature, the eerie creatures that dwelled in the darkness, and among those, how many even had feet? The notion of a ground assault was meaningless in the underworld, and it was especially meaningless for a city that stood above the abyss. The great chasm beyond the capital of Nether's kingdom did not only lead to the deepest stratum of the underworld. Somewhere there, far below, hid the abyss, a vast bottomless pit of elemental darkness that connected the underworld to the shadow realm. Nobody knew what hid in the abyss. Perhaps even Nether had not known its secrets. In fact, Sunny had a strong suspicion that the very reason the Demon of Destiny had built his laboratory on the edge of the great chasm was to study the dark mysteries of the abyss. The city grew around his citadel. Much later, a dark and unfathomable creature that rose from the abyss easily wiped out the settlement Nephis had created in her second nightmare. That was the kind of adversary the Stone Saints had fought. Today, however, they were going to fight Sunny, Nephis, and Saint. The three of them approached the city openly. In the past, specially enchanted boats and barges must have braved the swirling mist to approach the piers of the magnificent city, pushing nothingness away. They were long gone now, so Nephis simply summoned her wings and soared into the air. Her skin swelled with a gorgeous radiance, and a radiant white sword appeared in her hand. Saint turned into a torrent of darkness, taking Sunny, one of his incarnations, at least with her. The second manifested a pair of black wings and rushed after Nephis, following her radiant light. Neither Sunny nor Saint were visible, hidden from view by the vast expanse of impenetrable darkness. So, from a distance, it looked like a lonely white star was flying toward the ancient city, shining blindingly in the lightless abyss. In response to her radiant challenge, there was movement on the battlements of the outer stalagmites. Even from a distance, Sunny saw innumerable figures which had looked like statues before, slowly coming to life and turning their heads to gaze at Nephis. Those were stone saints, thousands of them, all consumed by the appalling plague of corruption. They stood on the ramparts of the outer stalagmites and glanced down from the shooting galleries that circled the stalactites as well. Even from a great distance, Sunny could feel the rabid malevolence of their collective malice, washing over the world like a tide. There are dozens of great abominations among them. His expression turned concerned, but it was not even the saints of tainted jade that concerned him. Instead, it was a single gaze that slammed into him from afar, threatening to crush his will. It was the gaze of the great Titan that reigned over the fallen city, and unlike the gazes of the tainted saints, it was not coming from the ramparts of the outer districts. Instead, it came from the levitating citadel of the Demon of Destiny. Sunny glanced at the dark spires of the magnificent structure that hovered above the abyss. His eyes narrowed slightly. There, on a protruding platform that faced the city, he could see a human form. From that distance, though, an actual human would have looked no bigger than an ant, which meant that the figure he was looking at was hundreds of meters tall. Sunny frowned, realizing who the adversary was. I'll be damned in the past. He had assumed the form of the Jade Titan, a member of the Stone Saint race, who was supreme and also possessed 7 soul cores. For a long time that being was purely theoretical, existing only as a manifestation of Sunny's abilities, but now, it seemed, he was about to encounter the real deal. A child of Nether who had been a supreme Titan once, but had since succumbed to corruption, possibly even one of the 7 who had received the mantles of the underworld from the Demon of Destiny. A dangerous foe, to say the least. The Jade Titan was perilous, but thousands of lesser tainted saints were not a minor threat either. Damn it! Sunny gritted his teeth, knowing that the battle was going to be a vicious one. Ahead of him, the tainted saints on one of the stalagmites raised their bows, ready to unleash a hail of arrows at the approaching spirit of light. However, before they could, Nephis thrust the blessing forward. A blinding ray of pure white light breached the lightless abyss, sweeping across the ramparts. An ocean of stone dust and white flames exploded outward, and a portion of the battlements plummeted into the swirling mist in a cloud of debris, littered with broken figures of the tainted saints. Just a few seconds later, Sunny and Saint dove into the dust cloud, landing on the cracked surface of a wide plaza. Sunny glanced at Saint, his expression grim. "We'll handle the Titan? You take care of his army?" Saint glanced at him with her usual taciturn indifference, then nodded lightly. In the next moment, her shadow boiled, and a legion of stone warriors rose from it. Chapter 3086. Saint's Army. A legion of fearsome shades rose from the darkness, assembling into a flawless battle formation behind Saint. Those were the shades of her kin she had slain on the way to the heart of the underworld, no less than 1,000 of them, all encased in suits of impregnable plate armor, wielding sublime weapons, most holding indomitable shields. That was the strange thing about the Stone Saints. When a human died and became a soldier of the Shadow Legion, they had to be armed. That was why the shadow of the King of Swords worked tirelessly in the forge. Their memories were gone, and so were their mundane weapons. The Stone Saints, however, did not part with their armaments even in death. Maybe it was because of how their armor and weapons were forged, or perhaps it was because the Stone Saints had a special relationship with their weapons, making them a part of themselves. In any case, it was a boon for Sunny. Saint commanded a legion of 1,000 warriors, including more than a dozen supreme lieutenants. It was a formidable force, no doubt about it. However, the enemy outnumbered them 5-1. Not only that, but the abominations held the defensive advantage, while the structure of the city itself made that advantage utterly deadly. And yet Sunny and Nephis could not allow themselves to stay and help Saint in this battle. The fallen Jade Titan was a far more terrifying enemy, and if he was allowed to join the fight, a legion of 1,000 powerful shades would be wiped out like an army of dolls. So Saint had to conquer the city of her creator, her original creator. That was not Sunny herself. There was no time to waste, so Sunny rushed forward after receiving a nod from Saint. One of his incarnations stayed with her, and a measure of Neph's flames was augmenting her as well, so he was not too worried about his loyal shadow. If things turned from bad to worse, he would be able to rescue her and flee, at least. The odds were stacked against them, but there was one silver lining to this troubling situation. Since the vast city of the Stone Saints was illuminated by myriad lanterns of divine flame, it was populated by shadows. So, Sunny had regained access to most of his powers, including Shadow Step. His mobility had been restored to its usual preposterous levels. For now, he continued to fly, rushing across the vast expanse of the magnificent city with the help of two great black wings. Nephis was just ahead, piercing the darkness like a radiant star. Behind them, Saints' taciturn legion and the army of tainted saints clashed in a ferocious battle. The abominations acted with a level of unity and discipline that one would never expect from nightmare creatures. Instead of rushing toward the invaders as a frenzied mob, they maintained their positions, implementing a flawless defensive strategy. Those stationed on the battlements high above unleashed a devastating barrage of arrows and javelins at the enemy below. Those guarding the neighboring stalagmites moved to block the aerial bridges surrounding Saints and her warriors on all sides. As the hail of arrows fell, Saint raised her shield and struck its rim twice. Behind her, 1,000 of her kin did the same, their shields ringing like a twin thunderclap. Then they moved with swift precision. Their battle formation split into 7 distinctive units, each turning into an impregnable fortress as the Shadow Saints raised their shields and brought them together. When the terrifying barrage of arrows fell, none managed to pierce the turtle-like formations. The cacophonous ringing of a myriad arrows striking 1,000 shields fused into a deafening litany. Saint, who stood in front of the 7 centurii, raised her shield as well. Then she pointed her dark blade forward. The warriors of her legion flowed forward like 7 streams of inky darkness, never breaking the shield domes protecting them. 4 centurii advanced toward the aerial bridges connecting the great stalagmite to the neighboring districts, while 3 marched toward the enchanted elevator platforms that would soar to the stalactite above. Saint led the larger contingent, while the smaller one was commanded by the shadow of the great devil, Absence. Soon, the warriors of the Shadow Legion poured onto the arching aerial bridges. The great abominations among the defenders rushed forward, and at the same time the supreme champions of Saint's dark army exploded from the turtle formations as well. When they clashed, the entire city shook. Shades of higher ranks were weaker than their living counterparts by definition, since they barely possessed any will. However, Sunny was there, fused with Saint. He could empower them with the help of the curse. As a result, the clash was not as one-sided. Most importantly, the Legion of Shades wielded one decisive advantage over their enemy. They were led by Saint, and Saint was far more powerful and deadly than any of the great abominations among the fallen defenders of the city. Her dark blade flashed and her shield crashed into the armor of the enemy champions. The power of nothingness drained their strength, and in just a few moments the phalanx defending one of the aerial bridges crumbled. The silent shades poured into the breach, slaughtering the enemy with merciless skill and precision. Moments later, the tainted saints they killed joined the ranks of Saint's army, slowly chipping away at the numerical advantage the abominations held. Ruby dust spilled on the cold stones of the desolate city, and the deafening clangor of battle tore apart the silence that had ruled it for thousands of years. Far ahead, Nephis and Sunny were flying toward Nether's citadel. Long before they reached it, however, the titanic figure standing at its landing platform leapt forward. The great titan soared through the air, easily breaching a dozen kilometers of distance, and landed on a vast empty space at the heart of the city with an earth-shaking thunderclap. There, the entire peak of a colossal stalagmite had been cut, creating a vast circular expanse of flawlessly flat stone. An ancient structure seemed to have stood on that field of stone once, resembling an enormous amphitheater, but it lay in ruins now. What little of its walls still remained was toppled with a thunderous rumble, plummeting into clouds of dust. The Jade Titan was close enough for Sunny to discern every detail of his intricate, fearsome armor, the same armor Sunny himself wore. However, at the moment, he was not looking at the Titan's black armor, and neither was he thinking about how to slay that terrifying foe. Instead, Sunny felt a cold chill running down his spine, because he sensed that there was something very wrong about that great Titan. Something about it felt eerily sinister and utterly wrong. It was as if he was not looking at a terrifying nightmare creature, but at something else controlling the Jade Titan like a puppet and wearing his colossal body like a glove. Chapter 3087. Flower of Darkness, Nephis. Something is wrong with this Titan. Sunny did not have to speak aloud, because the two of them were mentally connected by Cassie's aspect. Cassie herself could hear them too, as well as perceive the world through them. So she must have sensed the eerie discrepancy between what the Jade Titan was supposed to be and what it actually was. Neph's voice resounded in his mind a moment later, sounding wary. I can sense it too. The two of them were already quite close to the ruined amphitheater, moving at breathtaking speed. They would reach the ancient arena in mere seconds, which meant that they did not have a lot of time to understand what was wrong about their terrifying enemy. Cassie? There was a moment of silence, and then her voice resounded quietly, as if coming from a great distance. Sunny could barely hear her. The Titan, elemental darkness, what you see is merely shell. His consciousness, across the entire city. He controls all the tainted saints. There was a pause, and then Cassie spoke again, this time clearly. But something is controlling the Titan. I cannot see what. Sunny frowned. If even Cassie could not sense what was truly going on, then things were dire. Knowing your enemy meant that you were halfway to achieving victory after all, not knowing your enemy. That meant being halfway to defeat. She did tell them a few important pieces of information, though. The Jade Titan was not merely the towering colossus in front of them. In fact, the stone giant was merely his physical shell. The nightmare creature's titanic consciousness, meanwhile, spread across the entire city, controlling all its defenders. That was why their movements were so precise and strategic, resembling that of a disciplined army, not of a horde of frenzied abominations. If the Titan was destroyed, the cohesion of the tainted army would be greatly diminished. But more importantly, Sunny's vague suspicion had been proven true. The fallen colossus was indeed being controlled by something. What kind of creature was capable of subjugating a great Titan? Sunny was not sure, but even if he desperately didn't want to find out, he was going to learn the answer shortly. He cast his shadow sense outward, trying to sense a second presence. But there was nothing. He did not sense any movement around or behind the Jade Titan, and neither did he sense another living shadow hiding in the darkness. By then, the two of them had already passed the last of the gargantuan stalagmites, escaping into the vast expanse of empty air surrounding the ruins of the great amphitheater. They were seconds away from clashing with the Jade Titan, and Neph's radiance already fell on his dark armor, making it glisten in the darkness. There's nothing. Feeling a cold chill run down his spine, Sunny focused his senses on the area immediately behind the towering colossus. Neph's radiance, as well as ambient lights emanating from the magnificent city, were the reason why Sunny could encompass it with his shadow sense. Still, there were countless places here where elemental darkness still pooled, cold and deep like an ocean, blocking his senses. Those places were like blind spots for Sunny, since he could not perceive anything hidden in the darkness. But the shape of those blind spots was telling in and of itself. He did not need to perceive something to know that it was there. At the moment, the absence of shadows was informative as well. The negative space created by elemental darkness was what Sunny tried to discern, and when he concentrated on the absence of shapes, his breath caught for a moment. Sunny's eyes widened and his skin crawled. What the hell is this? Despite having experienced all kinds of horrifying encounters, for a split second, Sunny felt taken aback. Because there, indistinguishable from the surrounding darkness, something was extending from the great Titan's back. It was a gargantuan tendril of elemental darkness. The Jade Titan was at least 200 meters tall, and the tendril was easily supporting the weight of his titanic body. It was like a stone flower blooming at the end of a long black stem. What truly terrified Sunny, however, was that he could not sense the source of the tendril. It stretched across a dozen kilometers, gradually growing thicker, and disappeared into the boundless darkness of the great chasm behind the city. There was no light in the chasm and therefore no shadows. So, Sunny did not know how far down the tendril extended. Perhaps it rose from the abyss itself. Damn it all! They entered the city expecting to fight a great titan, but what they truly faced was a creature of darkness that could control a great titan like a puppet. Beings of darkness did not conform to the familiar framework of ranks and classes, but it had to be as powerful as a nightmare creature of a high class, at least, or perhaps even something more terrifying. Most of all, this scene looked familiar. Even though the scale and scope were entirely different, it looked eerily similar to the first battle they had fought in the underworld. The battle against an eerie creature that used the corpses of fallen stone saints as its shells. Was that the same being? If so, its tendrils extended across the entire underworld, stretching for thousands of kilometers, and it had been watching them all along. Finally, Sunny realized why the mysterious creature had never attacked them for the second time. Why would it attack if all this time they had been moving toward its maw? That! Sunny felt like they were woefully outclassed. A being who could envelop all of the underworld with its tendrils was too terrifying to imagine. They were powerful, but they were not powerful enough to fight something like this. However, now that they had come to the edge of the abyss, they had no choice but to fight it. And if that didn't work, then they could only attempt to flee. Sunny pushed the terror out of his mind, composing himself. It's just an eldritch horror that lives in the abyss. What was the big deal? If the creature could easily kill them, it would have done so months ago, at the entrance to the underworld. If it wasn't afraid of Nef's light, it would not have used stone shells to hide from it. Yes, it was terrifying and powerful, but it wasn't all powerful, which meant that they could still defeat it, or at least they could resist it. Gritting his teeth, Sunny relayed his discovery to Nephis. In the next moment, they reached the ancient arena and attacked. Chapter 3088. Death or Liberation. The reality of the battle changed. Before, they were facing an army of tainted saints and their commander, the Jade Titan. Now they were facing an army of tainted saints, the Jade Titan, and the true enemy, a harrowing abyssal creature that hid its presence, but was the greatest threat by far. So their strategy had to change as well. But before that, Sunny and Nephis needed to learn the true nature of their enemies. For example, the stone golems they had fought before were merely shells that the creature of darkness used to hide from Nef's light. Once the vestige of darkness within was destroyed, the golems simply crumbled like the lifeless constructs they were. But the Jade Titan was different. He wasn't a lifeless shell. Sunny could perceive its corrupted soul, and Cassie could read the truth of his profane existence. That meant that he was a living creature, and yet that creature was seemingly being controlled like a puppet by the abyssal tendril of darkness. So what would happen if that tendril was destroyed? Would the Jade Titan crumble as well? Or would he simply be liberated from the influence of the creature of darkness, remaining a dire threat? Sunny and Nephis desperately needed to know the answer to that question, and many more as well. As they reached the vast ruins of the ancient amphitheater, Sunny plummeted down, aiming to barrel into the Jade Titan's chest. The two of them were equal in rank and class, after all. Even if only one incarnation of Sunny entered the fight, he was still confident in his ability to pose a significant challenge to the towering stone colossus. His confidence was swiftly dispelled as he neared the Jade Titan, though. From this close, he could see what hid behind the visor of the abominable Titan clearly. It was vast, impenetrable, unfathomable darkness, and as Sunny launched his rapid attack, that darkness moved. The elemental darkness drowning the ancient city moved with it. In an instant, the beautiful radiance of the countless lanterns that illuminated the city dimmed, and so did Nef's brilliant light. The darkness surged, devouring it, and Sunny found himself surrounded by a lightless expanse. He was blinded and drained of power, his will straining under the crushing weight of the enemy's malevolent intent. Saint was far away, so Sunny could not see anything, however. He could still hear. And so, he heard the ground floor of the ancient amphitheater cracking under the Jade Titan's boot, as well as a deep, reverberating groan produced by the titanic plates of his stone-like armor scraping against each other. Hidden in the darkness, the loathsome colossus was moving his hand to intercept the enemy, to squash Sunny like a bug. Sunny's daring attack, it seemed, was destined to fail. But that didn't matter. His purpose was merely to distract the Jade Titan for a moment, nothing more. The real attack came from behind him, where Nephis was streaking across the dark void like a radiant star. As she raised the blessing, its already blinding blade swelled with annihilating light. And when she brandished it, the vast city was momentarily drowned by pure white brilliance. A ray of flawlessly white light cut the darkness apart, severing reality itself and scorching its parting edges. The Jade Titan failed to react to Changing Star's attack in time. In fact, there was no time to react. The ray she unleashed was pure light, after all, and it traveled with the speed of light, biting into its target in an instant. However, its target was not the abominable Colossus. Instead, the ray of devastating light incinerated the air above the great Titan's shoulder and extended past it, plunging into the unfathomable darkness of the colossal tendril hidden behind his towering figure. Then there was a blinding flash. For a moment, the world turned into an annihilating white abyss. The elemental darkness the Jade Titan controlled was washed away by its merciless tide, releasing Sunny from his blinding prison. He still couldn't see anything, though, and neither could he sense any shadows. No shadows existed in the world of flawless purity Nephis had summoned into reality. Then came the shock wave of the Titanic explosion. Sunny was protected from it by the unimaginable mass of the Jade Titan, and he still felt like the weight of the entire mountain chain above suddenly slammed into him. He was thrown back like a rag doll, his bones groaning under the tremendous strain. He didn't even want to think about how hard the Jade Titan, whose back absorbed most of the devastating impact, was hit. As Sunny struggled to keep himself in the air, the deafening roar of the explosion washed over him like an avalanche. A hurricane wind rose when an incalculable volume of air rushed to fill the vacuum created by the immolating heat and obliterating force of the titanic detonation. It was only then that the white radiance consuming the world dimmed a little, allowing Sunny to see blurry shapes of the surrounding stalagmites. The blinding light vanished slowly, allowing darkness to creep back. The first thing Sunny saw was the staggering figure of the Jade Titan, his fearsome black armor cracked and superheated, emanating a fierce incandescent glow. Then Sunny's gaze moved behind the loathsome Colossus, and there he saw a gargantuan tentacle countered by the dimming light, torn and convulsing. It was raptured and separated from the body of the Jade Titan, whipping through the air as rivers of liquid darkness spilled from its depths. Severed from the control of the abyssal horror, the towering Colossus swayed and fell to his knees. The impact of his fall made the fractured, melted arena shudder. Sunny stared at the kneeling Colossus, forgetting to breathe for a moment. Come on, die! He desperately hoped that the great Titan would collapse and crumble like an empty shell, removing itself from the deadly equation of this dire battle. But Sunny's silent plea was not answered. Instead of crumbling, the Jade Titan raised its head slowly, staring back at him with an even greater malice. Suddenly, the suffocating ocean of his abominable will felt even more crushing, as if it had been freed from a debilitating burden. And somewhere behind, in the distance, Sunny's eyes widened when he saw the lights of the magnificent city dimming one by one. The absence of light revealed a second immense tentacle of true darkness rising from the great chasm beyond. Sunny's expression collapsed. He cursed quietly. Damn it all! I don't want to be fated anymore. Chapter 3089. Two Titans. The Jade Titan had been liberated from the tendril of abyssal darkness, but instead of crumbling like an empty shell, he remained whole, apart from the damage his armor received in the explosion. The cracks in the fearsome armor were already closing, being repaired by the same living stone enchantment Sunny's own jade mantle possessed. The radiant glow suffusing the stone-like armor slowly dimmed as it was cooled by the cold currents of flowing darkness. The ocean of the great Titan's vast will had become even more oppressive, even more malevolent. It washed over the city, making the flames illuminating it tremble and dim. Far away, a second colossal tendril of darkness emerged from the great chasm. Somewhere behind, Saint and her legion were engaged in fierce battle against a vastly superior enemy. Sunny gritted his teeth. The situation did not look good. The Jade Titan, the army of fallen stone saints, the eldritch horror of the abyss. Any one of these forces was terrifying enough to pose an existential threat, but all of them combined together? There was no telling how the battle would end. For now, all Sunny and Nephis could do was fight. Her composed voice resounded in his mind, sounding more somber than usual. Sunny, I'm going ahead. Her meaning was clear. Nephis was going to confront the creature of darkness and attempt to destroy it, or at least hold it back. That meant that Sunny had to handle the Jade Titan. Godspeed. A radiant figure flashed past him, moving with the speed of lightning toward the edge of the magnificent city. Sunny spread his scorched wings wide, hovering in the air as he threw a grim look at the abominable colossus below. The Jade Titan was already rising from his knees, the chilling darkness nestled in the visor of his helmet boiling with malevolent will. How the hell do I even kill that thing? Sunny frowned faintly, evaluating the situation. The armored stone colossus was fearsome, emanating an almost palpable aura of dread and oppression. However, he was not the great Titan Sunny had to destroy. He was merely the vessel that served as the confluence of the abomination's titanic soul. The Titan's avatar, the Jade Titan himself, was embodied by all the fallen stone saints in the city. So, to defeat him, Sunny would have to wipe out every single one of the tainted saints, including the abominable Colossus. Luckily, Sunny himself was far more than what met the eye when one looked at him. The Shadow Legion was an extension of his soul, and so were his shadows. In fact, the forces he controlled were many times more fearsome than the fallen stone saints the Jade Titan commanded. It was just that Sunny was fighting a dozen battles in other places at the same time, so he could not unleash the full force of the Shadow Legion in the underworld. He had to win this battle with what he had at hand. The good news was that with every tainted stone saint he destroyed, a part of the Jade Titan would die, making the abomination weaker, while at the same time Sunny's forces would grow. The bad news was that Saint and her army were fighting a losing battle against thousands of powerful nightmare creatures entrenched in formidable defensive fortifications, so it was difficult to predict which side would actually emerge victorious. All Sunny could do was rely on Saint, knowing that she had never failed him before his own job. Meanwhile, was to confront the abominable Colossus, the core of the great Titan's power, and prevent him from reaching the battlefront. As for Nephis, she had to contend against the abyssal horror. Each of them had a role to play, and if anyone failed, the rest would fall like dominoes. That was if the situation did not change, of course. If something went wrong, then even with all three of them performing flawlessly, they would still be doomed. Let's kill a Titan, then. Sunny eyes glinted darkly behind the visor of his helmet. A great Titan? Facing a creature like that was a deadly affair, sure, but Sunny also really wanted the shade of the Jade Titan to join the Shadow Legion. Not only would that increase his overall power by quite a lot, but it would also allow Serpent to assume the same form. Currently, there were no shades among those Sunny ruled that Serpent could use to unleash its full potential below. The Jade Titan had finally steadied himself and looked at Sunny, the darkness around him moving to devour all light. Sunny pursed his lips. The very nature of the enemy suppressed his powers, making the thought of fighting that thing seem suicidal. But then again, Sunny already had a solution for that particular problem. Folding his wings, he plummeted toward the fractured floor of the great amphitheater. As Sunny fell, he turned into a shadow and then released it from the narrow confines of a human form. The true extent of his lightless existence, vast and shapeless, deep like a sea, revealed itself and then coalesced into a towering figure. Just a few moments later, a second Colossus landed on the shattered stones, making the whole immense stalagmite quake. He was just as towering as the Jade Titan and wore a suit of fearsome black armor that looked almost exactly the same. Two Jade Titans faced each other, looking like twin brothers. The only difference between them was that behind the visor of one impenetrable darkness nestled, behind the visor of another, though there burned furious white flames, illuminating the ancient arena around them. A colossal odachi formed in Sunny's hand, its blade glistening in the darkness. As if to answer, cold darkness flowed from beneath the Jade Titan's armor. coalescing into a menacing greatsword. Raising the odachi, Sunny struck it twice against his right pauldron. Instead of reciprocating the gesture, the Jade Titan moved forward like a walking mountain. Chapter 3, Theory 90. Born into an endless war, Sunny clashed with the Jade Titan, feeling an ocean of malevolent will bearing down on him like a crushing tide. Both of them were truly titanic in size, standing as tall as the great statues of the forgotten shore. Nevertheless, they moved with speed and agility that beings of that size were not meant to possess, making the island-sized stalagmite beneath them quake and crumble. The Jade Titan was a nightmare creature, but he seemed to possess a chilling, lethal battle skill that was no surprise. If the armor he wore was indeed the same as the Jade Mantle, then he would have had to defeat thousands upon thousands of enemies to bond with it. Their swords clashed, and before Sunny knew it, his odachi was caught in a bind and pushed down, the tip of the enemy's terrifying greatsword sliding across its spine toward his faceplate. He turned his torso and slammed his palm into both blades, throwing the greatsword off course. Crazy. Sunny had fought powerful nightmare creatures before, and he had also fought nightmare creatures that retained their sinister cunning and combat skill. However, abominations of higher classes were usually too vast and inhuman to fight as a person would. The Jade Titan, however, was both colossal and possessed the skill of a sword saint. That was a terrifying combination Sunny had not expected to witness, let alone be subjected to. Worse than that, the shadow of the abominable colossus was hidden in the deep darkness. Sunny could not attack it, could not sense it, and therefore could not predict the enemy's next move. With both swords temporarily out of the way, Sunny continued the motion and slammed his shoulder into the breastplate of the fearsome colossus, hoping to throw him off balance. There was a deafening thunderclap, and a devastating shockwave radiated outwards. However, the Jade Titan did not even flinch. Instead, it was Sunny who was thrown back. It felt like he had slammed into something utterly, fundamentally immovable, as if his shoulder had struck the indomitable core of the hollow mountains. His pauldron cracked, and his shoulder joint pulsed with sharp pain. As Sunny staggered back, darkness surrounded him like a cold whirlpool, effortlessly suppressing the blinding radiance that spilled from the slit of his visor and from the seams of his armor. His light dimmed, but it wasn't extinguished. His will wasn't shattered either. He was still ready to fight. Somewhere far ahead, a bright flash tore apart the darkness for a fleeting moment, succumbing to the tide of lightlessness with unnatural swiftness. That was Nephis confronting the abyssal horror. Sunny could not discern what was happening there, but he doubted that things were going smoothly. Far behind, Saint and her soldiers were besieging the soaring fangs of the ancient city. Despite the superior numbers of the enemy, they were advancing. Saint had shattered the defensive formation on one of the aerial bridges, leading her centuria to slaughter the abominations. The stone saints were not ordinary soldiers, though, in human battles, victory was achieved when the enemy's morale was broken and the hostile soldiers turned to flee. It was during the disastrous rout that most casualties happened. The breaking point itself, meanwhile, happened after a relatively minor number of soldiers perished. Losing 1 in 10 soldiers was often enough to make the rest surrender to panic and come undone. Even nightmare creatures knew fear, and while they rarely retreated, overwhelming losses made most of them surrender to frenzy. The tainted saints, however, did not break. They did not flinch or stagger either. Instead, they continued to fight with the same disciplined, composed determination, even when the casualties among them mounted. They continued to fight until every last one of them was wiped out. Total annihilation. That seemed to be the only way to defeat the stone saints. That was why even when Saint breached their formation, the battle on the aerial bridge did not end swiftly. It continued, with the warriors of the abominable legion stubbornly holding their ground as they were cut down one by one. However, Saint herself did not stay to oversee their fall. Responding to her silent desire, Sunny pulled her into the shadows and brought her to a different bridge where another centuria of her army was straining to push back the enemy. There, the Fire Saint was entangled in a devastating duel against 2 great demons of the enemy legion, dark flames boiling and spreading like waves. Saint's arrival immediately shifted the balance, causing the abominable defenders to lose their advantage. With 2 of the aerial bridges breached, the tide of the battle was turning. Soon enough, the Centauriae that had conquered them would be able to attack other forces of the enemy from the rear, causing their defenses to collapse. The battle above, meanwhile, was progressing slowly. The shadow of absence led a smaller contingent of soldiers to conquer the stalactites, accompanied by 2 of the strongest supreme lieutenants under Saint's control. Shattered corpses plummeted from great heights, disappearing in the billowing mist below, and fewer arrows struck the shields of the attacking shades. There was progress, but it wasn't without cost. At this point in the battle, Saint and her soldiers were still fighting at a great disadvantage. They slayed countless abominations, but their losses weren't insignificant either. For now, she was barely managing to keep the number of warriors under her command even. Many of them were vanquished, while new shades took their place. That was why Saint moved from one centuria to another, engaging the strongest champions of the enemy legion in fierce duels. She could not eradicate thousands of foes in an instant, but if she cut down their great commanders, her own lieutenants would be able to turn the situation around, and those slain champions were becoming her lieutenants too, pushed back by the Jade Titan and struggling to resist the suffocating tides of true darkness. Sunny could not help but feel a jolt of dark glee. "Look well, bastard. That is what a real champion looks like." As if to respond, the gargantuan greatsword shattered his defenses and left a deep dent on his breastplate. At that moment, rattled and blinded by pain, Sunny learned what it felt like to be hit by a mountain. Chapter 3091. Limits of the Mundane. Staggering back and reeling from pain, Sunny raised his odachi, deflecting the follow-up strike of the titanic greatsword, this one a vicious thrust aimed at the slit of his visor. "Oh, right. That's not the first time I've been hit by a mountain." In Antarctica, Goliath had given him a good kick. Sunny almost died that time, actually. He only survived because of the undying chain. This time, all the damage he received was a dent on his armor. That was progress, at least. Actually, he was not much smaller than Goliath now. His rank was superior as well, so if one of them were to be destroyed by a kick from the other, it wouldn't be Sunny who ended up lying on the ground as a pile of shattered stone. Sadly, the Jade Titan was far more powerful than Goliath, and far more harrowing as well. The Jade Titan was a nightmare creature, but before succumbing to corruption, he had been a warrior on the front lines of the Doom War. Sunny, meanwhile, was a seasoned veteran of the age of the nightmare spell. Both were supremely skilled and experienced, so their battle was like a clash between the champions of 2 epochs. They were going to see which one was more skilled, which one was more lethal, and which one was luckier as well. There was a deafening, ear-piercing screech when their swords collided, the gigantic odachi pushing the titanic greatsword aside. The tip of the greatsword scraped across the side of Sunny's helmet. Missing the visor in the next moment, he growled and pushed forward, slamming the pommel of his odachi into the Jade Titan's faceplate. The force unleashed by the impact was harrowing enough to shatter the gates of a fortress, producing a devastating shockwave. However, the faceplate wasn't even bent. Before the shockwave could spread, Sunny already chained his next attack, delivering a lethal horizontal slash aimed at the adversary's neck. The endless expanse of his immense blade raised a hurricane as it cut the winds apart, moving with such speed that its black surface began to glow, heated by air friction. Come to think of it, Sunny was already shadowing Nef's soul flame ability, so what was stopping him from augmenting his weapon just like she did? He was used to his ways, his power neatly divided among his 7 shadows, but Nephis could spread her flame however she wished, making it more flexible. So now, even though this incarnation of Sunny only encompassed 1/7 of his soul, he sent half of the power the flames granted him into the black odachi. Instantly, the orange glow of the great blade swelled with blinding radiance, turning flawlessly white. The darkness was pushed further back. Sunny aimed to behead the Jade Titan, but the detestable colossus raised a hand and blocked the blow with his impregnable vambrace. And yet the incandescent blade cut the stone-like metal, biting deep into the creature's wrist. Sunny smiled darkly and moved, avoiding the counterattack. Or at least he tried to. The Jade Titan ignored the waterfall of ruby dust escaping from the breach in his armor and turned his hand, catching the blade of the giant Odachi in an iron grasp. Sunny's smile faltered. Crap! In the next moment, the gigantic stalagmite quaked. The two of them, a colossus wreathed in a billowing mantle of elemental darkness, and a giant illuminated by the radiance of pure white light, clashed in a whirlwind of steel and destruction, sending deep cracks running through the mass of ancient stone. The fury of their battle was like a world-ending cataclysm, swiftly descending into utter mayhem. This was a battle between two titanic beings that were only one step away from becoming deities, a clash so ferocious and terrifying that no mortal could survive witnessing it, let alone being caught in its devastating storm. And yet there was no chaos or frenzied abandon in the way the two towering giants fought. Despite the utter mayhem unleashed by the dire forces of their clash, both moved with flawless precision and dreadful purpose, full of uncompromising killing intent. Their power was astounding, and their martial skill was sublime. Put together, power and skill made for an unholy union. The entire island-sized stalagmite shuddered and groaned, great slabs of stone sliding from its crumbling slopes and falling into the swirling white mist below. The battle raged at a harrowing, frenetic pace. Creatures of this size were not meant to move with such awful speed, and yet they did, defying the universal laws of existence. Sunny pushed against the constricting limitations of the world with his will, weaving it into his movements, while at the same time using the feather of truth trait of the Jade Mantle to precisely manipulate his weight. The Jade Titan, he was not sure what means the harrowing creature used to break through the limits of the mundane, but the result was even more devastating. The Jade Titan was stronger than this lonely incarnation of his, and far more ancient. By all accounts, the detestable Colossus should have swiftly gained the upper hand in their battle, but Sunny was stubbornly holding his ground, lashing out with vicious blows every time the titanic greatsword left a mark on his armor. He could do so because of his skill and tenacity, because of his demonic lineage and divine aspect, and because the Jade Titan had taken the brunt of Nef's fiery explosion earlier as well. The extensive damage dealt to his armor by the obliterating shockwave had already been mended, but the repaired swaths of the stone-like metal were still weaker than the rest of the fearsome carapace of black jade, and since Sunny remembered where the cracks had been located, he could aim his blows at the invisible seams. Ruby dust was spilling on the fractured floor of the ancient amphitheater like a flood. At the same time, torrents of shadows were being consumed by the encroaching darkness. Sunny's titanic form did not escape the dreadful battle unscathed either. With both giants suffering grievous harm and swiftly mending their broken bodies, the battle was deadlocked, with neither side managing to deliver a deadly blow. And as the two of them fought, the battles on the edges of the magnificent city continued to rage as well. Chapter 3092, Edges of Reality. At the southern outskirts of the ancient city, the battle between Saint's Legion and the fallen defenders had turned into a vicious slaughter. The Shades had conquered several aerial bridges and pushed forward, invading the neighboring stalagmites and attacking the enemy forces, resisting other Centuriae from the rear. However, in the process, countless Shades had been vanquished, and despite the casualties among the tainted saints, the scales of battle shifted in their favor. Especially so because the soldiers of the Jade Titan were not mindless abominations either. Those of them who defended the stalactites above swiftly shifted their tactics, maneuvering to avoid absence and his contingent while raining down death and destruction upon the warriors of the Shadow Legion down below, before the Shade Saint commanded could raise their shields to protect themselves from the enemy arrows and javelins. But once they engaged the enemy in melee, they couldn't maintain their turtle-like formations. Of course, the archers could not shower them with projectiles either, since doing so would mean destroying their own comrades. However, when Saint cut down the enemy champions on the aerial bridges and the defensive lines of the tainted saints were breached, dooming them to be wiped out, the forces on the upper layer of the city drew the strings of their bows and unleashed a ruthless barrage, slaying both friend and foe. Countless tainted saints were wiped out by the hail of arrows. Countless Shades were vanquished as well. However, due to the fact that the defenders of Nether's magnificent city held a staggering numerical advantage, they could allow themselves to swallow these grievous losses. Saint's soldiers, on the other hand, were few in number compared to the enemy, so the loss of each shade was felt much more. Even the shades of the great abomination Saint killed could not make up for the staggering casualties caused by the ranged barrage. For a few minutes, the tides of the battle turned against her and her soldiers. Then, however, there was another shift. That was because Saint led her warriors across the conquered stalagmites and used the enchanted elevator platforms to send 2 of her centuriae up, while the remaining 2 stayed below to defend the elevators. Soon the enemy forces above were pincered between different contingents of the Shadow Legion and besieged from 2 sides. The situation below, meanwhile, was reversed. The tainted saints attacked the remaining centuriae, while the Shadow Saints fought a dogged defensive battle. Sunny managed to contend against the Jade Titan in the center of the city, while on its outskirts, the tainted saints were being gradually ground to dust, so he felt a feeble hope ignite in his heart. It was a hope that they would slay the great Titan in time. But of course things rarely went according to his hopes. Just as the battle was reaching a breaking point, Neff's strained voice resounded in his mind. "Sunny, I can't fight it alone?" His expression dimmed. That was what he had been afraid of. The Jade Titan and the Tainted Saints were fearsome foes, but they were also known. The abyssal horror Nephis faced, meanwhile, was a complete mystery. And more than that, it was far more powerful than even a great Titan, at least of the cursed rank. It was naive to expect that someone, even Nephis, would be able to defeat it alone. In fact, it was already a miracle that she had been able to contend against the eerie creature long enough for Sunny and Saint to make considerable progress. Someone had to reinforce her, and there were not a lot of choices. It had to be either the incarnation of Sunny fighting the Jade Titan, or the incarnation of Sunny supporting Saint. Both choices were a dead end, though. If Sunny fled from the battle against the Jade Titan and joined Nephis, the abominable Colossus would either follow him and put Nephis in even more danger, or rush toward the outskirts of the city to wipe out Saint and her soldiers. If Sunny abandoned Saint, the situation would turn even worse. She would be robbed of his augmentation, diminishing the ability to slay the great abominations among the defenders of the city. The balance of the battle would swing in favor of the Tainted Saints, and soon the Legion of Shades would be destroyed. That would allow thousands of nightmare creatures to rush to the center of the city, where they would aid the main vessel of the Jade Titan in the battle against Sunny, resulting in his defeat. Something would have to be sacrificed no matter what he chose, and, more than that, chances were that the fall of one pillar of their forces would cause the rest of them to topple one after another, ending in complete defeat. Damn it all! Barely managing to deflect another obliterating blow of the Jade Titan and feeling the stones beneath his feet shift, the colossal stalagmites swaying precariously, Sunny threw a dark gaze at his enemy. The abominable Colossus was just as fearsome and domineering as before, albeit far more battered. His armor was covered by a net of cracks, and ruby dust marred its surface. Even his breastplate was split by a deep fracture. A chilling darkness nestled between its jagged edges. Despite his fractured state, however, the Jade Titan was far from being defeated. He wasn't even rattled. His power had diminished because of all the tainted saints slain by the Shadow Legion, but it was still terrifying and overflowing, drowning the ancient city like a lightless sea. Even while channeling Soul Flame, Sunny was weakened and suppressed by that darkness. That was another reason why he had failed to destroy the abominable Colossus, suffering countless wounds instead. The pain washed over his mind, cleansing it of all unnecessary thoughts. It was a dreadful, pure state of being, of perceiving the world. Everything was sharp and clear, devoid of ambiguity and nuance. Everything was as it was, not as he would want it to be. The harsh edges of reality cut him, but they were also revealed in front of him in stark purity. That was how Nephis saw the world, perhaps, and at the moment Sunny saw it as well. And so he made a decision. As the Jade Titan thrust his sword forward, the towering figure of his radiant enemy dissolved into shadows and disappeared from sight. In the next moment, however, a dark lightning flashed through the air and crashed into his chest, causing the damaged breastplate to crack, and sending the Colossus staggering back. That dark lightning was a round shield forged from stone-like metal, Saint's shield. It pierced the outer layers of the Jade Titan's armor, lodging itself in the epicenter of a vast web of cracks. And before the Jade Titan could regain his balance, Saint herself fell from the darkness above, landing on the shield with a deafening thunderclap. In the utter darkness that surrounded them, her black sword flashed like a guillotine's blade. Chapter 3093. Castling faced with a losing choice, Sunny could only decide which sacrifice would be the least painful. Among three threats facing them, the abyssal horror was the most perilous, so helping Nephis hold it back was imperative. Among the remaining two threats, the detestable Colossus took priority. The most obvious solution would have been to send the incarnation-augmenting Saint to Nephis, sacrificing the army of shades. They would not be destroyed immediately, at least buying Sunny some time. However, that would only extend the battle, not turn its tide. So Sunny decided on a riskier, more daring solution. He escaped the detestable Colossus, while at the same time summoning Saint to take his place. Without its commander, the army of shades would be wiped out far faster. However, would that even matter if the defenders of the city lost their commander as well? Sunny had fought the Jade Titan to a stalemate, and that stalemate showed no signs of being broken anytime soon. Saint, however, was an unknown variable. Sunny did not know how she would fare in a battle against the harrowing Colossus, but he had a hope that she could perform better than he had alone. Saint was a supreme devil, after all, only one step away from becoming a tyrant. At the moment she was enhanced both by the power of shadows and by Neph's flame. Most importantly, she wielded authority over true darkness, just like the Jade Titan, and over nothingness as well. And since true darkness was vulnerable to nothingness, Saint was actually better suited to fight the detestable Colossus than Sunny was himself. Granted, no matter how powerful Saint was, the gap between a devil and a titan was still vast. There was no guarantee that she would be able to leverage her unique affinity to defeat the colossal, nightmare creature. It was a gamble. But Sunny was willing to gamble. He had no other choice, considering that all other options felt like a delayed but assured defeat. So he shifted figures on the board, betting it all on Saint. As Sunny rushed through the shadows to assist Nephis, her shield slammed into the Jade Titan's fractured breastplate, damaging it further and getting lodged in the stone-like metal. At the same time, the influence of the Shield of Nothing washed over the crumbling ruins, suppressing the profane powers of the towering Colossus. Saint landed on the shield like a bolt of dark lightning, her sword flashing to widen the gap in the Jade Titan's armor. The two impacts followed each other so rapidly that the deafening roar they produced sounded like a single thunderclap. Nephis, recall your flame from Saint. It seemed like the worst possible moment to rob Saint of the powerful augmentation of Neph's flames, but Sunny had a good reason to do just that. Apart from the fact that Nephis needed all the power she could muster in the battle against the abyssal horror, there was also the issue of compatibility. While her flames were a boon for Saint, they did not empower all of her. In fact, as far as those of Saint's powers that were rooted in elemental darkness went, they were actually weakened, considering that she would have to challenge the Jade Titan's authority over true darkness. That was not something she could afford. With one final blaze, the white flames dancing behind the visor of her helmet were extinguished, and the last feeble light shining in the boundless darkness disappeared without a trace. Darkness fully swallowed the crumbling arena, drowning the world like a tide. Saint moved in the embrace of that darkness. Her figure was graceful and towering, more than 10 meters tall, however. Considering the colossal size of the Jade Titan, Saint looked like a little mouse in front of the immense expanse of his gargantuan body. So instead of trying to contend against the giant in a melee battle, Saint did something different. She pushed off the vibrating surface of her shield and plunged into the wide fracture in the Jade Titan's breastplate. What? Even wrapped around Saint and sharing her senses, Sunny was surprised by her rapid action. But he had no time to dwell on that because, almost at the same time, he escaped from the shadows at the northern edge of the city where Nephis had been fighting the abyssal horror. As soon as he did, he saw a blinding meteor flash through the air and collide with the slope of the stalagmite behind him. Shattering it with a deafening boom, a radiant figure rose from the billowing cloud of dust, its form torn and distorted. Two fierce eyes blazed with incinerating light, peering at something ahead. Sunny glanced in that direction as well. There, the immense tendril of flowing darkness rose from the abyss, looming above the world like a twisting spire. Its surface boiled as white flames danced across it, devouring vast swaths of the eerie darkness. As Sunny watched, the entire upper length of the tendrils, hundreds of meters in length, broke from their base and plummeted down. However, it did not disappear. Instead, it struck the cobblestones of a wide plaza below and spread, turning into a perfectly circular pool of darkness. The severed tendril collapsed back into the great chasm, disappearing in the boundless abyss below. Here, the roar of the vast waterfall was much louder, chasing away the cold silence of the underworld. White mist swirled below, higher than in the rest of the city, plunging into the deep chasm. The tendril seemed to be wary of the mist, so it retreated. The remains of the first one, which Nephis had torn apart with a devastating explosion, slithered back into the abyss as well. But the pool of darkness remained. Nephis levitated from the field of debris, hovering in the air near Sunny's giant helmet, as they both glanced down at the inky black circle. Her broken form was already restoring itself, her figure regaining its usual grace. Sunny hesitated for a moment, then asked, his deep voice resounding like the roar of thunder, "What is the situation?" Nephis seemed to have frowned. "I'm not sure. That thing has not done this before, but it's immensely powerful. Its vitality is inexhaustible, and it's full of tricks. We should be careful." Her tone was concerned. "It's like that thing is playing with us." Just then there was movement under the surface of the black pool. The darkness swelled, rising in two spots, as if two bubbles of air were escaping deep water. However, instead of bursting, they seemed to absorb all of the darkness. At the same time, their form changed. In mere seconds, two figures were standing on the shattered stones, looking at Sunny and Nephis with eerie smiles. Sunny felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Curse it. The first figure, the one facing Nephis, looked like a man wearing an intricate suit of plate armor. The second, facing Sunny, was that of a tall woman with a graceful figure and breathtakingly gorgeous face. She wore a simple tunic, holding a long sword in her hand. Both were perfectly black, their hair, their skin, their clothes, their weapons, their black eyes glistening like four bottomless oceans of cold darkness. Sunny did not fail to recognize them. Naturally, the man facing Nephis was a dark copy of Sunny. The gorgeous visage of darkness facing him was a dark copy of Nephis, and the pressure they emanated was in no way lesser than that of two powerful supremes. What kind of devilry is this? As Sunny spoke, the dark copy of Nephis moved. She unhurriedly raised her sword and pointed it at him, still wearing the eerie, frozen smile. His eyes widened. "Oh, crew!" And the next moment, a ray of abyssal darkness escaped from the tip of the black sword, reaching him in an instant. It struck his battered breastplate, easily piercing it. A moment later, an annihilating explosion of pure darkness tore the jade mantle from within, obliterating the towering colossus. His figure burst into 1,000 jagged shards of stone-like metal, shooting in all directions like shrapnel. The world quaked. All surrounding buildings were severely damaged, some collapsing in a cloud of dust and debris. A moment later, the obliterating shockwave reached them, destroying the rest. Neph was pushed away by the shockwave, slamming into the ground a good kilometer away. If Sunny had not turned into a shadow in time, he would have been utterly destroyed. Thanks to his quick reaction, though, he managed to escape the annihilating explosion while merely sustaining grievous wounds. His soul was torn to shreds and severely damaged, but retained its overall integrity thanks to Soul Weave. The jade mantle was utterly ruined, what little remained of it retreating to hide under his skin, blinded by traumatic pain. Sunny rolled out of the shadows hundreds of meters away, hissing as he threw a gaze at the dark copy of Nephis. The thing was still smiling, slowly turning her head in his direction. His own copy, meanwhile, stepped into the darkness and instantly appeared near the real Nephis, a black odachi manifesting in his hands. 1,000 chains forged of pure darkness exploded from the ground, melting in the light as they attempted to bind her limbs. At the same time, innumerable shapes surrounded her as a dark imitation of the Shadow Legion rose from the ground. Sunny's heart turned cold. He gritted his teeth, feeling both wary and indignant. Damnation. Chapter 3094, Dark Reflection. Nephis had yet to rise from the ground, and now countless black chains shot from the darkness to pull her down, pressing her into the shattered stone with terrifying force. The cold chains melted and vanished like ghostly fog as soon as they touched her brilliant radiance, but there were simply too many of them. Even as some were destroyed, more piled on, covering her like a dark tide. At the same time, myriad figures rose from the dark spaces that her light couldn't reach, surrounding her like an army of monsters. They were the profane copy of the Shadow Legion, a swarm of twisted, ghastly apparitions born from elemental darkness. Their claws, stingers, and mandibles reached toward Nephis, aiming to sink into the pure white flames of her radiant body, and most deadly of all, the dark expanse of a flawlessly black odachi was already falling, aimed at her neck. That was the danger Nephis faced. However, if anything, she was better off than Sunny, because while Nephis faced his dark copy, he was facing the dark copy of Nephis, and fighting Nephis, copy or not, was a truly terrifying prospect. How is this even possible? As the tip of the pure black version of the blessing aimed at Sunny once again, he cursed and dove into the shadows. In the next moment, another ray of annihilating darkness pierced the world, followed by a devastating explosion. Instead of heat and flame, a wave of obliterating cold and elemental darkness washed over the ancient city, swallowing both light and the shadows it cast. Sunny would have been expelled from their embrace, but he had already escaped it himself. Appearing behind the eerie facsimile of Nephis, he brandished his odachi, severing one of her arms at the shoulder. A split second later, the blade of his sword flashed again, cleaving deep into her torso. Sunny swiftly disengaged, twisting the odachi as he pulled it free. The wounds he had dealt to the dark apparition were ghastly, more than enough to debilitate any enemy, if not outright kill them. But the dark copy of Nephis did not seem to care at all. It turned, the eerie smile still playing on her lips. As she did, tendrils of impenetrable darkness shot from her severed shoulder, fusing with her falling arm. At the same time, the deep gash in her torso disappeared without a trace, washed away by the wave of dark flames. A moment later, her flawlessly black body was whole and pristine once more, not a scratch on it. Even the rift on her tunic was gone. Sunny stared at the black fabric, his expression dim. Well, that's just cheating. He was suddenly covered in cold sweat, and it wasn't because of the aftershock of receiving soul damage. It was simply because he knew what it meant to face Nephis on the battlefield. Nephis, changing star, the star of ruin, was a walking, breathing engine of mass destruction. Her powers were indescribably annihilating, capable of annihilating entire cities in one fell swoop. Worse than that, Sunny had personally armed her with a terrifying weapon that allowed her to focus that widespread destruction and channel it with pinpoint accuracy. And if that was not enough, Nephis was also nearly indestructible, capable of recovering from any damage in a matter of moments. Her ability to heal herself was so potent that even she did not know its limits. Nothing had managed to destroy her, so far at least. So how was Sunny supposed to fight that? Actually, he knew perfectly well how. After all, in the past, he had spent countless hours thinking about that exact scenario, back when competing with Nephis had been an integral part of his world. And what he came up with was that if the two of them ever fought, trying to kill her would be a fool's errand. Instead, Nephis, like other beings who were functionally immortal or close to it, had to be restrained and contained, not destroyed. Granted, he had imagined facing Nephis while wielding most, if not all, of his powers. But now the Shadow Legion was engaged in a war against the Barrow Wraiths on the Forgotten Shore, while his other incarnations and shadows were scattered across the Dream Realm, entangled in various conflicts to protect humanity against the encroaching apocalypse. All he had was this one shadow. That's not good at all. At that moment, some distance away, a blinding flash illuminated the world. A roaring ring of white flame exploded from the real Nephis, consuming the chains that bound her and devastating the dark reflection of the Shadow Legion. The copy of Sunny, meanwhile, escaped destruction by stepping into the darkness. A moment later, he reappeared, delivering a deadly strike. The dark blade of his odachi collided with the blessing, and he was pushed back. Before Nephis could counterattack, though, a second version of Sunny appeared from the dancing flames behind her, running her through with his sword. The first one was already launching another attack. There are only two. Lunging forward to prevent the dark copy of Nephis from unleashing another annihilation ray, and inwardly preparing to escape a wide-area explosion of black flames, Sunny frowned in concentration. His mind returned to the moment when the eerie thing mended her wounds. In particular, he remembered how the cut on her tunic had disappeared, as well. That little detail was the most important, despite seeming like the most insignificant. That was because it revealed a hidden truth about these dark clones, as well as about the frightening being that had created them. It proved that these copies were merely approximations of what the creature believed Sunny and Nephis to be, not exact replicas. Nephis could heal her body, but she could not repair her clothes. The creature of darkness did not seem to know that. In fact, it might not have understood the concept of clothes at all. Similarly, it must have observed Sunny manifesting 2 incarnations, but it did not know that he could summon 7 of them, which meant that the dark clones it had created did not really possess the same powers Sunny and Nephis possessed. They merely wielded a facsimile of what they could do. It was the creature's own power shaped to resemble that of its enemies. That was without a doubt an important distinction. Whether Sunny would be able to make use of it, though, was still a question. Chapter 3095. The Best Strategy. The dark copy of Nephis did not deflect, evade, or block Sunny's blow. She simply turned slightly, allowing his blade to pierce her shoulder instead of her neck, while at the same time delivering an attack of her own. She had accounted for one of her arms being severely damaged, the muscles cut and the bone shattered, using only one hand to drive the black longsword forward. As a result, a split second after Sunny's Odachi pierced her shoulder, her blade pierced his chest. He staggered back, barely saving his heart from being shredded. A grim smile twisted Sunny's lips. It seems I've grown too accustomed to the jade mantle. If he was still wearing his armor, the dark copy of Nephis would not have been able to drive her sword through his breastplate with one hand. Well, she would have probably aimed for his armpit instead and dealt just as much damage because he was one step behind. He had already realized that the creature of darkness had created a facsimile of Nephis based on its flawed understanding of her, but he failed to realize that it fathomed Neph's battle art, too. When Nephis was a saint, she had woven her ability to mend herself into her battle style. That was why most pillars of combat collapsed when facing her. Any other opponent would attempt to defend themselves, which dictated their movements. Nephis simply chose which parts of her would be mangled while enduring the pain to deliver lethal attacks. People did not fight like that. Even nightmare creatures did not fight like that. While they did not necessarily possess a self-preservation instinct, they were overcome by a frenzied desire to destroy and devour remnants of the flame, and being needlessly killed went against that overwhelming obsession. But Nephis had all but liberated herself from the deeply ingrained need to avoid harm. That made most of the combat experience Sunny possessed nearly useless in this battle. In fact, it was not only useless, but actively worked against him. He needed to rid himself of all preconceived notions and approach this fight as a blank page. But did he really? Clutching his chest, Sunny looked at the dark copy of Nephis. Far away, the real Nephis calmly grasped the sword that impaled her and pulled it sideways, slicing her own fiery body to drag it out. At the same time, she flourished the blessing, deflecting the attack of the second incarnation of the dark clone and unleashing a radial wave of immolating flame. Sunny could not hear her voice, but her lips moved, no doubt invoking the names of fire and destruction. The incarnation assaulting her from the front managed to escape in time. The one who had pierced her with the sword, though, was a moment too late. After all, his sword was still in her grasp, and she was not letting go. The flames engulfed him, and a stifled scream drowned in their hungry roar. Sunny faced the dark version of Nephis with a resolute expression. At the same time, he thought, "To hell with this." Fighting a version of Nephis with only one incarnation? Sure, it was an exciting idea. He was very curious to see how their battle would go, but he wasn't crazy. Well, he wasn't that mad. So without a second thought, Sunny turned around and fled. Restraining and containing Nephis? That was a good strategy. The best strategy, however, was not to fight her at all, Before the dark copy of Nephis could fry him the same way the real Nephis had just fried a copy of him, Sunny dove into the shadows and escaped them near her, near the real changing star that was. For a moment he was enveloped by unbearable heat. Then Sunny turned into a shadow and wrapped himself around Nephis, augmenting her and fusing their two titanic wills into one. The power of shadows fused with the power of purifying flames, and the resonance between the two increased Neph's strength explosively. That thing can only use those of our powers that we have shown in the underworld, and it doesn't seem capable of shaping. Nephis assumed a defensive stance, looking around warily. The remaining incarnation of the dark clone was yet to reveal itself, so an attack could come from any angle. I see. Her own copy, meanwhile, summoned a pair of magnificent black wings and was descending from the vast emptiness above like a dark comet. Get ready. The dark blessing moved, and an annihilating ray of pure darkness shot from above. At the same time, a ray of blinding light shone from the ground. The two collided mid-air, and the fabric of reality itself seemed to part, space and time rippling as a wave of unfathomable destruction was unleashed upon the world. Everything was consumed by darkness. Then, everything was drowned by blinding light. The world shook, and a deafening roar obliterated all notion of silence. Its very concept was made meaningless, banished from Sunny's memory. In that roaring inferno, Nephis moved, raising her sword. In the next moment, a black blade bit into its radiant surface, throwing Nephis back. She slid across the shattered stones, looking ahead with a grim expression. There, a winged spirit of darkness landed gracefully and took a step forward, a dark figure rising from the flames to fuse with her. Instantly, the chilling pressure she exerted multiplied, crashing into Nephis like a devastating wave. She pursed her lips, ready to attack. Then, however, something about Nephis changed. Sunny felt it. A brief moment of confusion, a hint of hesitation, a spark of recognition. And then, a deep, debilitating fear rose from the depths of her being. Weakening her grip on her sword, Nephis suppressed that fear, but its claws still left their mark on her resolve, making her voice sound shaken and low. I know you." The dark copy of Nephis continued to smile as she walked forward, the black surface of her sword consuming all light. Nephis gritted her teeth. "I know you, don't I? We've met before." She inhaled deeply, then slowly exhaled. "In the depths of my nightmare." Sunny, who was confused and startled by her reaction, suddenly understood. That creature, the abyssal horror that extended its tendrils from the boundless darkness. It was the same creature that Nephis had met in her second nightmare. Nephis believed it to be, at least. It was the horror that wiped out the settlement she had built and made her kneel. Slowly, Neph's fear receded, replaced by a dark, frightening, scathing joy. A cold smile slowly appeared on her bloodless lips. "I begged you for mercy back then." Grasping the hilt of the blessing with both hands, she pointed it at the dark apparition. "I've wanted to meet you again for a long, long time, but I won't be begging today." A moment later, she lunged forward with a speed so dire that it seemed like she had simply blinked out of existence, appearing near her copy at the same time. Two swords, one forged out of pure light, the other forged out of pure darkness, collided, sending a shock rippling through the entire underworld. Chapter 3096, Darkness Bringer. No matter how curious Sunny was about what would happen if he and Nephis woke up one day and decided to battle to the death, he had to admit that he was badly matched against her dark copy here in the underworld. If he was wielding all his powers, he honestly did not know what the outcome would be. Sunny was an immensely powerful being himself, but his true strength lay elsewhere. His shadows were immensely powerful, and he commanded a deathless legion of shades. He was also a master of sorcery, of course. If his domain were to be included, then Neph's had to be included as well, which meant that the question wasn't really who would win in a fight, him or Nephis. The question was, who would win in a war, Sunny and his legion, or Nephis and all of humanity. Sure, his shadows were powerful, but so were the people who pledged their loyalty to Nephis. Kai, Effie, Cassie, Morgan, Sation, and the rest of them, hundreds of saints, all the legacy clans, countless masters, billions of mundane humans. Was his shadow legion stronger than all of humanity? Sunny wasn't sure, of course. He was tempted to believe that he would win. There were simply too many tools in his toolbox. While Nephis was a force to be reckoned with, given enough time, Sunny could probably weave something to defeat her. But then again, there were countless sorcerers serving her as well, and human ingenuity was endless. So who was to say that she would not create something to deal with him, too? At the end of the day, Sunny was still most likely poised to win, simply because of how insidious his domain was. The longer a war continued, the stronger the Shadow Legion became. So, unless Nephis learned how to fully destroy shades, humanity would fall to the tide of shadows sooner or later. But then, after their trip to the tomb of Ariel, Nephis possessed the knowledge of corruption. So wasn't she capable of turning Sunny into a nightmare creature by simply whispering a few secrets into his ear? Luckily, Sunny did not need to find out, because they were one and the same now. A war between them was no different from the right hand trying to kill the left hand. And since he was limited in what he could unleash here in the underworld, the best decision he could make was to augment Nephis and lend her his strength in the battle against the creature of darkness. It was like two hands holding the hilt of a sword, no different from the first lesson in swordsmanship Nephis had given him. One hand pushed, the other pulled. That was how the blade could move with deadly speed, slaying the enemy before they could react. So now Nephis was empowered by his embrace, facing the dark copy of herself, who was augmented by the remaining incarnation of his copy. What was it that Nephis had said? That the creature of darkness was playing with them, no matter how uncomfortable it made Sunny feel. He had to admit that she was probably right. After all, if that thing was powerful enough to create nearly flawless copies of two supreme wielders of divine aspects, as well as make a puppet out of a great titan, then it most likely did not need to mimic them. Had it created the dark copies simply for its own amusement? If so, Nephis was going to make that thing take them seriously. She had always been strong-willed and determined, facing each battle earnestly. How could she not, if for her, fighting meant burning herself alive? But now, Neph's resolve reached a truly frightening level. Her mind was focused and clear. Her will was absolute. Her killing intent was scorching, burning in her eyes, like a merciless inferno. She thought she recognized the creature, the same creature who had haunted her nightmares ever since she became a master. Facing it as a mere sleeper had been the greatest shock and humiliation she had ever experienced. Nephis was strong. Nephis was proud. But out there in the depths of the nightmare, she had been forced to kneel and beg it. It had taken her years to recover from that humbling defeat. She had only regained her confidence and her flame in the ruins of twilight, facing the ghastly visage of the soul stealer. And even if the wound only made her stronger in the end, she had never forgotten the bitter pain of losing it all to the abyssal horror. Now the same abyssal horror, or a being eerily similar to it at least, was right in front of her. She wasn't a powerless sleeper anymore either. Instead, she was supreme. She was changing star of the immortal flame clan, the living goddess of humanity. The woman who had slain the sovereigns and conquered the world, despite coming from nothing. The radiant blade of the blessing flashed as it cut the world, scorching the terrifying darkness surrounding her. Her brilliance was like an endless tide, burning the very thought of defeat away. Her body moved with the grace of a dancer and the precision of a natural-born killer, and her heart was utterly ruthless, both to her enemy and to herself. Sunny wanted to activate the dark embrace enchantment of the curse to soothe her pain, but Nephis refused it. She did not mind the pain. She welcomed it. Pain was the purifying fire that cleansed her mind and fueled her will, reminding her of what was at stake. The battle between Nephis and her dark copy was chilling. Neither of them worried about preserving themselves, only caring about ensuring that the damage their bodies received did not hinder their movements. As a result, their clash was perhaps the most brutal Sunny had ever witnessed. Their bodies were pierced, cut, and scorched, waves of white and black flames dancing across their figures and mending the damage, only for their healed flesh to be cut and mangled a moment later. It was utterly inhuman, only made more disturbing by the fact that Neph's focused expression never changed, while her copy's smile never faltered. The dire forces they unleashed wreaked havoc across the district of the ancient city where the battle was taking place, and the entire city quaked, enormous slabs of stone falling from the distant ceiling of the colossal cavern and plunging into the deep mist below. And throughout all of that, Sunny was observing the dark copy of Nephis intently, figuring out the ways in which it was inferior to the real deal. Chapter 3097, Vessel of Darkness. As Nephis fought her dark copy, on the opposite side of the city, the legion of shadow saints was slowly melting under the assault of their corrupted kin. Despite the devastating losses both armies had suffered, the abominations were still numerous, thousands of them swarming toward the elevator platforms that 200 shades defended. Far above, the shadow of absence led the remains of 5 centuriae as they pincered at least 1,000 of tainted saints, attacked from multiple directions. The battle formation of stalwart abominations was slowly shrinking as more and more of them fell. However, scores of shades were being vanquished as well. The remaining supreme shades clashed with the great champions of Jade Titan's fallen army, collapsing one after another. After all, even empowered by the will of the Lord of Shadows, they were not a match for living creatures of the same rank. But even as they were vanquished, the silent shades dragged their enemies with them into the cold embrace of death. The Shadow Legion still persisted in its mission, slaughtering the tainted saints and melting in the harrowing carnage of battle. The 200 shades below were soon reduced to 100, and then to just a few dozen, but even then the last of them stubbornly held their ground. Once those last defenders fell, the enemy would scale the great stalactites above and encircle Absence and his warriors. Then the army of shadow saints would be truly and utterly obliterated, but before that happened, their commander still had a chance to turn the tide. In the heart of the city, Saint had dived into a crack in the Jade Titan's armor. The abominable Colossus staggered and then slammed his fist into the cracked breastplate. His blow was so powerful that for a moment a blinding flash illuminated the crumbling stalagmite, and the net of cracks marring the surface of the stone-like metal deepened. It wasn't easy to damage armor that the demon of destiny himself had forged. Its battered state right now was the work of 2 supreme titans, Changing Star and Lost from Light. So the shockwave produced by the thunderous blow was truly devastating, fracturing the ancient stones beneath the terrifying giant's feet and making the colossal stalactites above sway. The Jade Titan's body could withstand the impact, but could Saint do the same? Apparently, she could. Before the thunderous ringing produced by the blow even grew quiet, the abominable Colossus shuddered and bent over, a waterfall of ruby dust spilling from beneath his helmet. A deafening sound, not quite a growl, but not quite a groan either, resounded in the impenetrable darkness, and leaning on his greatsword, the Jade Titan ripped a piece of his breastplate away. It was as if he wanted to plunge his hand into his own chest and crush the vicious invader between his fingers. But before he could, a strange shudder ran through his body. The Jade Titan straightened and let out a horrid, deafening roar. The low thunder of his titanic voice reverberated across the entire city, making the ancient stones vibrate and sending the flowing currents of true darkness into a frenzy. Then his shattered breastplate exploded outward. What escaped from the vast breach was not a torrent of ruby dust and stone shards, however, and neither was it Saint. Instead, it was a vast, unfathomable, billowing flood of darkness. The darkness rose above the colossal body of the Jade Titan like a boundless cloud, expanding and circling it like a whirlwind. It swallowed the lightless void above the ancient ruins looming above them, seething as it spun. A great maelstrom of elemental darkness was born in the void at the heart of the ancient city, churning as its vast currents spun around the battered figure of the abominable Colossus. Unlike the true darkness that drowned all of the underworld, however, this terrifying mass of it was different. It was far more malevolent, frenzied, and terrifying, permeated by the appalling scent of corruption. It was alive, controlled by a terrifying will. That boundless tempest of true darkness was the essence of the Jade Titan. The towering giant it had inhabited before, meanwhile, had merely been its shell, and now, like an empty shell, the terrifying Colossus collapsed. Its battered armor fell, as if the force that had been keeping it whole vanished. The enormous gauntlets, The shredded vambraces, the hill-sized pauldrons, the cracked breastplate, the fearsome helmet, all of it rained down like fragments of a shattered mountain, crashing into the fractured ground with devastating force. Clouds of dust rose into the air, and the crumbling stalagmite shuddered, one of its slopes shattering and sliding into the swirling mist below. Once the dust settled, nothing but a mountain of broken stone remained, rising above the broken arena of the ancient amphitheater like a solemn barrow. The shapes and intricate decorations of the fearsome armor could still be recognized in the debris, but just barely. Then another explosion tore the stone-like barrow apart, and a graceful figure slowly climbed to its peak. It was a graceful stone knight, her own armor bent and broken. Rivers of ruby dust flowed down from countless breaches, and harrowing wounds marred her jade body. However, the furious crimson flames that burned in her jewel-like eyes were still as cold and aloof as always. Saint's helmet was bent and fractured, so she raised her hands and removed it. Her hair spilled over her shoulders like a waterfall of sublime silk, and her inhumanly beautiful face was exposed to the cold winds of the underworld. She inhaled deeply as if remembering the long-forgotten scent of home. Then she raised her head and looked up at the titanic maelstrom of malevolent darkness above with a silent challenge. The darkness moved then. It shot downward with unimaginable speed, forming into a colossal vortex. The vortex struck Saint in the blink of an eye, flowing into her body like a flood. In just a few seconds, the entire boundless cloud vanished, absorbed by her. The Jade Titan had abandoned his main shell, after all, which meant that he needed a new, equally worthy vessel. The force of the forceful invasion threw Saint into the air. She soared through the darkness, crashed into the fractured floor of the arena, and rolled a few times, leaving a shallow crater and long trench in her wake. Then she moved slightly, pushing herself up to one knee. Saint swayed, the crimson fire burning in her eyes, dimming slightly. There in its depths, a hint of appalling darkness was straining to swallow her flame and replace it. However, even though Saint was merely a devil, the Jade Titan was struggling to consume her. She wielded authority over elemental darkness as well, after all, and since the true nature of the terrifying Great Titan was that of an ocean of darkness imbued with malevolent will, she could attempt to wrestle away control over that ocean too. As two wills clashed for control, Saint raised her shield slowly, and then she used all of her terrifying strength to slam it down into the fractured stones beneath. With a deafening groan, a violent tremor spread through the ancient stalagmite. It shuddered heavily and crumbled entirely, its entire peak shattering and falling down, carried by the avalanche of broken stone. Saint plummeted into the swirling mist of nothingness below. Chapter 3098, Usurpation. Smart. Sharing senses of both Nephis and Saint, Sunny could not help but concentrate more on the battle against the abyssal horror. After all, that was where most of his will was focused, and that was where the puzzle he had to solve to stave off defeat was hidden. But naturally, he kept an eye on Saint as well. Her actions just now were both daringly bold and deeply intelligent. Nothing of what had happened was a coincidence. It all transpired as she intended it to. Since Saint could not contend against the Jade Titan in a physical battle, she wanted to challenge him on a different battlefield. She wanted to challenge his authority over true darkness and crush it with her own. So she used means available to her as a wielder of darkness to deal a grievous wound to the dark heart of the abominable Colossus, thus forcing the Jade Titan to abandon his damaged shell. Then she allowed herself to be invaded by the ocean of elemental darkness and contained it within herself, struggling to remain in control. If Saint established her authority over the ocean of elemental darkness that the Jade Titan was composed of, she would vanquish the adversary. Not only that, she would consume him, reaping a tremendous boon. But if she failed to shatter the will of the loathsome creature with her own, she would be erased from existence, becoming its new vessel. Needless to say, that was a risky strategy, deadly even. After all, Saint was not a match for an ancient Great Titan, even if it had been wounded in a battle against Sunny. She was weaker, and her will carried far less weight. Even if they were of the same rank, the gap between them was as vast as a boundless abyss. The measure of authority the Jade Titan wielded was insurmountable, or it was supposed to be. At least Saint naturally knew her own limits. However, she also knew something else. Something that gave her a unique advantage in a battle of will against the harrowing nightmare creature. It was that she not only carried authority over elemental darkness, but also had an affinity to nothingness, which true darkness was vulnerable to. So Saint evaluated the structural integrity of the crumbling stalagmite and delivered one last targeted blow to its peak, causing it to collapse. Collapse into the clouds of white mist swirling above the great river, thus pulling herself, and the jade titan that had usurped her body into the insidious embrace of nothingness. There, the jade titan was suppressed while she was empowered, and so the playing field was leveled, giving her a chance to emerge victorious from their clash. Sunny did not know if Saint would truly be able to usurp the dark essence of the jade titan. Would she win the desperate struggle, or would she perish? He could only lend her support to his taciturn shadow and wait, knowing that the battle would be over soon. In the meantime, he had to focus on another, no less desperate battle, the battle against the abyssal horror. If he and Nephis were defeated by the dark copy, then whether Saint won or not wouldn't matter. Even if she did, the eerie being of the abyss would finish the Jade Titan's job. How is this thing so strong? Nephis and her dark reflection were entangled in a dreadfully ruthless battle, both straining to deal the adversary more damage than their powers could heal. They cut and burned each other's bodies, and they cut and burned each other's souls as well. White flame and black flame fused in a harrowing conflagration, incinerating the very air around them. Even the stones of the ancient city, which had withstood the endless tides of true darkness, were melting and flowing into the white mist as rivers of incandescent lava. At the same time, a dreadful cold encased the surrounding districts, making the magnificent buildings crowding them brittle like glass. At the moment, the two radiant spirits, one woven out of pure light, the other from impenetrable darkness, seemed evenly matched. Their devastating power, their transcendent skill, their razor-sharp intent, and their miraculous ability to recover from the most terrifying wounds were almost exactly the same, preventing one of them from gaining an upper hand. As a force of utter destruction, Nephis possessed few means of debilitating and containing her enemies, instead of simply obliterating them. So, facing an adversary who could not be destroyed, she was temporarily driven into a dead end. Even if the dark copy could not annihilate her in turn, prolonging the battle was not in Neph's favor after all. She was still a human, while the abyssal horror was not. Neph's resilience seemed inexhaustible, but it wasn't. And while she showed no signs of being tortured by the agony of her flaw, the pain was still putting a strain on her spirit. Even her uncompromising will had a limit. Her dark copy, though. Neither Sunny nor Nephis knew what it truly was, and therefore what its limits were. It might not have possessed any limits at all. So fighting it forever and grinding it down in a battle of pure resilience did not seem like a good option. In fact, the dark copy was already putting immense pressure on Nephis through the sheer endlessness of its ability to endure punishment. At the moment, the amount of damage it had shrugged off was harrowing enough to turn an entire continent into an ashen wasteland, and yet it showed no sign of slowing down, let alone of being shaken. Nephis was able to hold her own because of two reasons. One was her mastery of shaping, which the creature did not seem capable of replicating, and the other was her resolve. Having met the creature of her nightmares, she was more determined than ever to triumph over the adversary. As for her shaping, Nephis was primarily using it in two ways. She was using it to empower her attacks by invoking the names that had to do with flames and destruction, and she was also using the names having to do with passion to ignite and embolden her will. In that way, and due to being augmented by Sunny, she could fight on a level that no other Supreme could achieve. Still, time wasn't on her side. But it also was, because the more she fought the eerie apparition, the more time Sunny had to observe it and contemplate a solution. The more time the two of them had to adapt. In the end, Sunny came to a simple realization. It was that the dark copy was merely pretending to be a sovereign, but didn't really possess a domain. That was why the copy of the Shadow Legion it had summoned was composed of ghastly monstrosities instead of Sunny's actual shades. Therefore, the abyssal horror was not only fighting Nephis, it was fighting Nephis and all of humanity, and humanity had won countless weapons to fight against the horrors of the dream realm, conquering vast territories from them in a relatively short span of time. At that moment, Sunny's mind turned to one particular tool serving humanity. The idea he came up with was so diabolical that even he was taken aback for a moment, frightened by his own imagination. But after a few seconds of startled hesitation, Sunny regained his composure. There is no reason why it shouldn't work. Right? I don't think there is. So why not? Let's show this horrid hellspawn that there are deeper, far more terrifying layers of hell. Chapter 3099. Let There Be Light, Nephis. I have an idea. Engaged in a dreadful battle against the abyssal horrors creation, the very fabric of reality bending and parting in front of their blades, Nephis invoked the name of decay as she plunged the blessing into the impostor's flesh. The radiant surface of the sword blazed with a scorching radiance as it turned into a torrent of pure light, incinerating her adversary's body. At the same time, more names escaped from Neph's lips, echoing with primordial power and reshaping the world around her. The name of withering, the name of erosion, the name of sundering destruction took innumerable forms, after all, and she knew the names of all of them. The dark copy reeled and staggered back, her body disintegrating in a conflagration of radiant flames, only to be restored moments later. Her eerie smile remained the same, even if her lips had been turned to ash and made it into a grotesque grin. Nephis pressed the attack, even as the adversary's sword cut her flesh in turn. What kind of idea? Sunny collected his thoughts and then explained in a short and concise manner. You're going to have to split your attention. Once he was done talking, something cold and frightening flashed in Neph's eyes. Her lips twisted into a faint smile then, too. She dashed back, intending to buy herself a split second of respite. Damn. Huh? Was that really Neph's reaction? No, it couldn't have been. That was so unlike Nephis. Sunny must have heard wrong. Nephis grasped her sword with both hands and lunged forward, meeting her dark copy in a shocking explosion of annihilating carnage. Can we even survive that ourselves? Actually, never mind, let's do it anyway. Now that was Nephis, he knew. In the next moment, the tides of her will shifted, and her soul began to exert a subtle pull on the world. Forced to split her focus, Nephis suffered a harrowing wound just a moment later. Unlike all the previous ghastly wounds she had received, that one went against her intent, weakening her too much and sending her staggering back. The dark copy did not miss the opportunity, pressing the advantage and gaining the initiative in their vicious clash. The battle turned against Nephis then, but even while being pushed back, she coldly calculated every painful loss, guiding her adversary into destroying the least vital parts of herself, biding her time. And all the while, the subtle pull her will exerted slowly grew more forceful. Come on. Sharing her pain, Sunny gritted his teeth and counted heartbeats. The solution he had come up with was not difficult to realize, but demanded a bit of time to implement. Usually, it would not have been a problem, but attempting it in the midst of a battle was immensely difficult, especially a battle as intense as this one, where even the slightest distraction could spell doom. But this was the best chance to turn the tide against the abyssal horror. When Sunny asked himself how the dark copy differed from the real Nephis, he found too many answers. The eerie creature was merely emulating her powers, after all. There were things it could only vaguely approximate, and other things it could not replicate at all. The dark copy was not a carrier of the nightmare spell, for example. Its soul, if it had one, did not burn with the flame of divinity. It did not possess the fire, and its dark sword did not carry the blessing of the fire enchantment either, which made Nephis stronger the more her soul was damaged. But among those distinctions, few could actually help Sunny and Nephis defeat the eerie creature of darkness. The most obvious choice would be to make use of the blessing of the fire, asking Nephis to detonate her soul cores in order to harm her adversary and empower herself. However, there was no guarantee that the abyssal horror could not replicate the effects of the blessing of the fire once it observed them. That was why Nephis had not resorted to that strategy herself yet. No, Sunny needed something more decisive, more final, Finding out a way to bend the rules of the game was not enough. He needed to break the game board completely, leaving the adversary no chance to respond. That was why his thoughts turned to the longing domain. On paper, it did not grant Nephis any actionable benefits, except for an endless stream of spirit essence and the unfathomable weight billions of loyal souls added to her will, naturally, which were both passive boons. On the contrary, it was Nephis who could actively help her subjects. However, as a ruler of humanity, Nephis also ruled all the transcendent humans, and with them came the ownership of all the citadels they controlled, complete with various components of those citadels. Most components only affected the citadels themselves and the immediate areas around them, but there were exceptions. Those exceptions granted Nephis powers that she could use here and now, in the dark depths of the underworld, while the abyssal horror couldn't. So what Sunny wanted her to do was make use of one of those components, and after suffering a dozen terrifying wounds that left marks both on her body and on her soul, Nephis finally accomplished what she had set out to do. A vertical fissure suddenly split the fabric of reality apart, towering between her and the spirit of darkness that besieged her. That immense fissure was the first manifestation of an opening dream gate. The citadel Sunny had wanted her to make use of was the Night Garden, which possessed a component that allowed Nephis to open her dream gate between two places in the same realm. However, opening a gate could not be done in an instant, just like using a tether. It demanded a bit of time and a lot of concentration. The smallest distraction could interrupt the process as well. It was a testament to Neph's remarkable willpower and clarity of mind that she had managed to manifest a dream gate even while fighting an overwhelming opponent and being subjected to traumatic pain. Anyone else would have failed, but Nephis knew more about pain than any other human. She had taught herself how to remain focused even while suffering the most awful agony. More than that, she had learned how to use the agony to sharpen her focus, and now her dream gate was about to manifest. Of course, not just any gate could help them in their current predicament. Sunny had something truly special, prepared for the abyssal horror. The dark copy lingered for a moment, surprised by the sudden manifestation of the towering fissure, and before she could act, the nascent dream gate opened wide, exploding into a colossal, radiant portal. Nephis froze, ceasing all movement. In the next moment, the world seemed to come to a violent end. Sunny did not have words to describe the apocalyptic devastation he and Nephis had summoned into existence. In fact, he did not even possess the capacity to fathom it. All he knew was that when the fierce light pouring from the radiant dream gate touched the elemental darkness flooding the underworld, reality itself was torn apart. All of existence quaked. All of existence screamed in horror and pain. There seemed to be a colossal and obliterating shockwave, but Sunny was not sure, since the very concepts of force and impact had lost all meaning in the jaws of the unimaginable cataclysm. A deafening roar took away his hearing. A blinding flash took away his sight. An eerie cold took away his tactile sense. An immolating heart burned away his sense of smell. All he could taste was ash and fear. It was complete annihilation. Annihilation in its purest form. The underworld itself groaned, the ground beneath their feet suddenly turning into a slope. Even the mist of nothingness below seemed to have been banished, revealing the rapid current of the great river for a brief moment. The river boiled and evaporated, then was born anew. And worst of all, the calamity was not instantaneous. It was still continuing to spread and rage, growing more annihilating with each passing moment. Hell, indeed, it was hell. Sunny and Nephis had summoned hell into existence. To be precise, they had summoned a very particular hell, because the gate Nephis had manifested was not connecting just any 2 points in the dream realm. Nothing as prosaic as that. Instead, what Nephis had done was connect the dark depths of the underworld to the merciless abyss of the radiant sky above Godgrave. And that's a wrap on today's special compilation. I hope you enjoyed revisiting these final chapters of the 3000s as much as I enjoyed bringing them to you. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know which chapter or moment from 3065 to 3099 was your favorite. As always, thank you for supporting Kevin TV and for all the kind words you've shared, not only about the channel, but also about my growing family. Your encouragement truly means a lot. The journey continues with Chapter 3D100, and I can't wait to experience the next adventure together with all of you. Until then, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next chapter. This is Ben Harrison, signing off.